Nineveh. Sometime around 650, before the Common Era, there is a room in the palace that most people never see. Not the throne room, not the great hall where carved stone walls show armies marching and enemies kneeling and gods descending in beams of light. This room has a low ceiling, oil lamps that leave a thin film of smoke on everything, and the smell of wet clay that never goes away, no matter how many times the floor is swept. A man is sitting here. He has been sitting here since before sunrise. His name is not recorded anywhere. He is in the scribe, and his job today is the same as his job yesterday. He copies. In front of him is a clay tablet covered in wedge-shaped marks. He picks up his stylus and presses it into fresh clay with the practiced efficiency of someone who stopped thinking about the physical act of writing years ago. His hand moves. Marks appear. He does not pause to consider what he is copying, because that is not his job. His job is accuracy. The text in front of him might be a medical formula. It might be a record of astronomical observations made by priests 100 years before he was born. It might be a poem about a king who lived so long ago that even the kingdom he ruled has been forgotten by everyone except the people in this room. He does not know. He does not need to know. At the top of every tablet he copies, there is one line he writes from memory. He has written it so many times that his hand produces it before his mind has fully decided to begin. Palace of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria, king of the world. He writes it. He does not think about whether it is true. Outside, Nineveh is going about the business of being the largest city on earth. Tens of thousands of people moving through streets wider than anything most of them have ever seen anywhere else. Merchants arguing, soldiers drilling, priests processing, the river Tigris catching the morning light the way it catches morning light every morning, indifferent to whatever the city on its banks is doing. The man in the room does not look at any of this. He looks at the tablet in front of him. He is doing something that will matter more than almost anything else happening in Nineveh today. He does not know that. The king who ordered him to do it thinks he knows that, but understands it differently than history will eventually understand it. The king thinks he is building power. He is. But he is also building something else. Something that will outlast the power by 3,000 years. Something that will survive the destruction of this city and the erasure of this empire and end up in a museum in a country that does not yet exist. Read by people speaking a language that has not yet been invented. And the question the king never thought to ask, the question that his 30,000 tablets cannot answer, is sitting right there in the room with the scribe, quiet and patient and waiting. The question is not about power. It is about what power cannot reach. The scribe does not know any of this. He just copies. That is the thing about history. The people making it rarely know what they are making. Here is what you need to understand about Assyria before we talk about any one king. Assyria was not an accident. A lot of ancient empires get treated like accidents in the history books. A strong man appears, conquers some territory, calls himself king, then dies, and the whole thing falls apart because it was never built on anything except his personal ability to intimidate people in a room. That is not what Assyria was. Assyria was a system, a machine, built deliberately over centuries, refined through failure and success, optimized for a specific purpose. That purpose was control. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the region we now call Iraq, was both a gift and a problem for the people who lived there. The rivers flooded. The soil was rich. You could grow enormous amounts of food and support large populations. Large populations gathered in cities close enough to trade and compete inevitably produce the kind of complex, contested human situation that required someone to impose order or watch everything dissolve. Assyria imposed order. The city of Ashur, which gave the empire its name, sat on the western bank of the Tigris, positioned almost perfectly to control trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to the east. By the time we reach Ashurbanipal in the 7th century before the Common Era, Assyria had been expanding, contracting, and expanding again for roughly 1,000 years. The empire Ashurbanipal inherited was not built by him. It was handed to him by a long line of kings who had each added something: a new technique, a new territory, a new understanding of how to make large numbers of people do what you wanted without having to personally supervise every single one of them. That last problem, the problem of scale, is the one that separates empires that last from empires that do not. Think about it from the inside. You are a king. You control a territory so large that it takes weeks to ride from one end to the other. The people in the western part of your empire speak a different dialect than the people in the east. They worship gods with different names. They have different harvest seasons, different marriage customs, different ideas about what justice looks like. You cannot be everywhere at once. So what do? You build a system. Assyria's system had several components. The first was the army. The Assyrian military was the most professional fighting force in the ancient Near East, refined over centuries into something that went beyond simple battlefield effectiveness. It had engineers who could build siege ramps against city walls, cavalry units that could move faster than any infantry could respond to, supply chains sophisticated enough to keep an army fed deep in enemy territory for extended periods, and crucially, it had a reputation. By Ashurbanipal's time, the Assyrian army's reputation for what happened to cities that resisted was itself a weapon. Many cities did not resist. The calculation was simple. The cost of fighting Assyria was higher than the cost of surrendering to it. The second component was communication. Assyria built roads and established relay stations that allowed messages to move from one end of the empire to the other at speeds that would not be matched in that part of the world for centuries. The king in Nineveh could send a directive to a governor in a distant province and receive a response within days. This meant the empire had a nervous system. The king could feel what was happening at the edges, and the edges knew that the king could feel them. The third component is harder to name, but it matters more than either of the first two for the story we are telling. Assyria understood that physical control was never enough. You can garrison a city. You can station soldiers at every gate. But if the people inside wake up every morning thinking of themselves as belonging somewhere else, as being something other than Assyrian, then you are not really controlling them. You are just containing them. And containment is expensive and temporary. Real control happens inside people's heads, in the stories they tell about who they are and who has the right to rule them and what the gods want. This is why Assyrian kings built palaces the way they did. The walls of Assyrian palaces were covered in carved reliefs, enormous narrative images that told stories. The king hunting lions, the king receiving tribute from defeated enemies, the gods blessing the king's enterprises. Anyone who entered an Assyrian palace was being told something specific. The world has an order. That order is reflected in the movements of the heavens and the decrees of the gods. The king is the point where divine order enters human life. To resist the king is to resist the gods. Submission to Assyria was framed as alignment with the correct structure of the universe. But here is what Assyrian kings before Ashurbanipal had not fully exploited. The images on the walls could only reach the people who walked through those specific corridors. The reputation of the army could reach further, carried by word of mouth and the terrified accounts of survivors. But the deepest layer of control, the layer where you get inside someone's idea of how the world works and rearrange it so that your power seems natural and inevitable, that required something else. It required the written word. And written words required someone to collect them, organize them, and decide which ones the empire would officially own. That is where Ashurbanipal comes in. But before we get to him, spend a moment with someone who has no name in any surviving record. He was a soldier in one of the Assyrian provincial garrisons, stationed in a city, conquered a generation before he was born. The people around him had adjusted. They paid their taxes. Their children spoke Aramaic alongside whatever their grandparents had spoken. The local temple had been reconfigured to include Assyrian religious elements without entirely removing what had been there before. He walked his route every morning. He checked the gates. He watched the market for signs of trouble that rarely appeared. He had never been to Nineveh. He had never seen the palace. He had never heard of the room where scribes sat copying tablets. But what he was doing mattered to what was happening in that room. His presence in that city, and the presence of 10,000 soldiers like him in 10,000 other cities, was the foundation that made everything else possible. Power is always triangular. There is the person at the top with the vision. There is the administrative layer that turns the vision into policy. And there is the person at the bottom who makes the policy real with their body, their time, their daily compliance. The soldier at the gate had no idea he was part of something that would be studied 3,000 years later. That is also how history works. And here, at the beginning, is the question worth carrying through everything that follows. Ashurbanipal would build the most comprehensive archive of knowledge in the ancient world. He would collect 30,000 tablets. He would put his name on all of them and call himself the king of the world. He would read more than any king before him and understand more about the patterns of human experience than almost anyone in his era. And the person closest to him, the one person who had known him before the world decided what he was, would make a choice that all of that knowledge could not prevent and all of that power could not reverse. What does it cost to be the one who stays when someone you love chooses to go? That question has no answer in the tablets. It is the only question that matters. There is a line in one of Ashurbanipal's own inscriptions that stops most historians when they first encounter it. He wrote it himself, in his own hand, in careful cuneiform script that almost no king of his era could produce without a scribe's assistance. He wrote that he had read the beautiful clay tablets of Sumer and the obscure Akkadian writing that is hard to master. He wrote that he had examined inscriptions on stone from before the flood. He described solving complex mathematical problems. He spoke of these things with the particular pride of someone who had worked hard for something that was not expected of him. A king bragging about his literacy. That sounds strange to modern ears. We do not expect kings or presidents or anyone in power to brag about being able to read. But in 7th century Assyria, a king who could read and write cuneiform was genuinely unusual. Reading and writing were skills for professionals, for scribes, priests, administrators, the people who ran the day-to-day operations of an empire. Kings were trained to command, to judge, to project authority in the physical world. They had scribes for the rest. Ashurbanipal was different because his childhood was different. He was not born to be king. His father was Esarhaddon, a king who had fought his way to the throne through a civil war among his own brothers, and who understood better than most what happened when succession was unclear. Esarhaddon had several sons. The eldest, a young man named Sin-nadin-apli, was designated heir. He received the standard education of an Assyrian crown prince, military training, administrative apprenticeship, ceremonial duties designed to make him visible to the court as the next face of power. Ashurbanipal was somewhere in the middle of the birth order. Not last, not first, not the one the court was watching. And then Sin-nadin-apli died. The records do not tell us how. Disease, most likely. Given how efficiently disease moved through the ancient world, regardless of palace walls and royal physicians, what matters is the effect. The crown prince was gone. Esarhaddon, a man who had already watched one succession crisis tear his family apart, had to make a new decision about who came next. He chose Ashurbanipal, but by the time his father chose him, the years Ashurbanipal had spent not being the heir had already shaped him into something that standard crown prince training could not have produced. He had been educated differently, because he was not expected to rule. He had been sent into the educational track, designed for the priestly and scribal classes. He learned to read. He learned to write. Not the simple administrative cuneiform used for records and contracts, but the full literary language, including the archaic Sumerian that had not been spoken as a living tongue for 1,000 years but was still used in religious texts, in hymns, in the complex ritual literature that priests needed to perform their functions correctly. He learned to interpret omens. In the Mesopotamian world, this was not superstition. It was science, the movement of stars, the behavior of animals, the appearance of a liver from a sacrificed sheep. All of it was data. All of it was information about what the gods were communicating to the human world. Trained omen interpreters were some of the most powerful people in the Assyrian Empire, because they had access to a category of knowledge that everyone, including kings, depended on. Ashurbanipal learned their language. He learned astronomy. The Babylonian astronomical tradition was centuries old by his time and had produced records of celestial events going back generations. Patterns, predictions, a systematic attempt to understand the rhythms of the sky and translate them into information useful for human decisions. He learned medicine, or what passed for medicine in that world, deeply intertwined with ritual and religious practice, but also containing genuine empirical observation, accumulated over centuries of treating patients and recording what worked. All of this was the education of someone who was never going to have to stand on a battlefield or conduct a diplomatic negotiation. It was the education of someone who was going to spend his life in rooms with texts, working with the most complex and specialized knowledge his civilization had produced. And then his brother died, and his father called him into a different future. Think about what that transition felt like. Not emotionally, though that too. Think about it cognitively. He had spent years building a specific kind of mind, tuned to a specific kind of problem, reading, interpreting, finding patterns in complex texts, understanding how knowledge was organized and what it was for. And then suddenly he was being told that this mind was now going to sit on the throne of the most powerful empire in the world. He did not abandon what he had built. That is the crucial thing. Most kings who came to power unexpectedly adapted to the demands of kingship by leaving behind whatever they had been before. They became what the role required. They wore the mask until the mask became their face. Ashurbanipal wore the mask too. He had to. He commanded armies, He conducted campaigns. He made the brutal decisions that Assyrian imperial management required. He performed the rituals of kingship with the precision that the religious and political establishment demanded. But underneath all of that, the thing he had built in those early years stayed: the ability to read the world through texts. The understanding that knowledge was not just information, but power. That whoever controlled what was written down controlled something more durable than territory. And eventually, it became the project. There was a man in Nineveh during these years whose profession placed him at an interesting intersection of the world Ashurbanipal had come from and the world he was entering. He was an omen reader, an expert in the interpretation of celestial signs, and he had served in the court since before Ashurbanipal was born. His name appears in a few administrative documents but tells us nothing about him as a person. What we can reconstruct is his situation. He was one of a class of specialists who held enormous informal power in the Assyrian court. Kings consulted them before military campaigns, before the construction of major buildings, before practically any significant decision. When Ashurbanipal came to the throne, this man found himself dealing with something he had not encountered with previous kings. The new king could read the omen texts himself. He did not just receive interpreted reports. He could look at the raw material and form his own conclusions. This was, depending on how you thought about it, either wonderful or terrifying. It was wonderful if you believed that a king who understood the actual basis of omen interpretation would make better use of it. It was terrifying if your professional identity was built on being the necessary intermediary between complex knowledge and the person who needed it. If the king could read the texts himself, what exactly was your function? The omen reader did not write down his feelings about this, but the dynamic he was navigating points to something important about Ashurbanipal that most accounts underemphasize. Ashurbanipal was not just a collector of knowledge. He was a man who understood, with the precision of someone trained in it, that knowledge and access to knowledge were forms of political power, that the person who controlled what was written, who had it, who could read it, who decided what got copied and what got lost, that person had a kind of power that armies could not simply take away. You can conquer a city. You can kill its king. You can tear down its walls and scatter its population. The Assyrians knew how to do all of those things and did them regularly. But you cannot conquer an idea that has been written down and copied and distributed. You cannot kill a text the way you kill a man. You can burn a library, but if copies exist elsewhere, the knowledge survives. And if you own all the copies, if you have gathered them all to one place under your name and your authority, then you have done something that armies cannot. Ashurbanipal was still a young man when he came to the throne, probably in his early 20s, and the full scale of what he would eventually build was not yet clear, even to him. But the intellectual foundation for it was already there, laid down in those years when he was not supposed to matter, when he was being educated for a life that the palace had never intended him to lead. The mind that would build the greatest library the ancient world had ever seen was not built by ambition. It was built by accident, in a room where a boy who was not the heir sat learning to read texts that kings were not supposed to need. Esarhaddon was a king who had seen what happened when a father did not plan carefully for succession. His own accession to the throne had been a catastrophe. His father, Sennacherib, one of the great warriors of Assyrian history, had made a choice that tore the royal family apart. He had designated Esarhaddon, a younger son, as heir over his older brothers. The older brothers did not accept this. When Sennacherib was assassinated, almost certainly by one or more of his own sons, The result was a civil war that Esarhaddon eventually won, but that left scars on the dynasty that never fully healed. Esarhaddon knew this history not as a story. He had lived it. He had been the younger son who was chosen over the older ones, who had watched his family fracture, who had fought for a throne that should have been handed to him without violence. He understood, at a level that was almost physical, what it cost when fathers made impossible choices between their children. And then, with full knowledge of all that, he made an impossible choice of his own. In approximately 672, before the Common Era, Esarhaddon issued a succession treaty binding the court, the provincial governors, and the vassal kings of the empire to support his chosen heirs. Heirs, plural. Ashurbanipal would become king of Assyria. Shamash-Shumukin, another son, would become king of Babylon. On the surface, this seems reasonable. Babylon was not just another city. It was the most ancient and culturally prestigious urban center in Mesopotamia, with its own traditions, its own priestly establishment, its own sense of itself going back over 1,000 years. Governing it as a straightforward Assyrian province would have required a level of cultural suppression that risked constant rebellion. Giving it a king of its own, one with Assyrian royal blood, seemed like a way to honor Babylon's identity while keeping it within the Assyrian orbit. The logic was not unreasonable. The execution was a disaster waiting to be built, because the arrangement Esarhaddon designed was not actually equal. It could not be. Ashurbanipal in Nineveh would be the senior king, the one to whom Shamash-Shumukin in Babylon would be formally subordinate. The succession treaty made this explicit. Shamash-Shumukin was supposed to treat Ashurbanipal's word as the word of their father. He was supposed to defer to his brother on matters of policy, security, and anything touching the wider interests of the Assyrian Empire. In other words, Esarhaddon gave Shamash-Shumukin a throne and then made sure the throne had a ceiling. Why did he do it this way? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. He may have genuinely believed the arrangement would work, that two brothers who had grown up together could maintain a stable and cooperative relationship across the 400 miles separating Nineveh from Babylon. He may have calculated that anything short of full subordination for Shamash-Shumukin would create a competing power center that would eventually challenge Ashurbanipal's authority. He may have been trying to thread an impossible needle, to honor both sons without fully satisfying either. What the treaty does not show is any apparent awareness of what it felt like to be Shamash-Shumukin, to be the brother who received the ancient city, the prestigious posting, the title of king, and then to read the fine print and understand that king, in your case, meant something different than what it meant in your brother's case. Your brother received Assyria, the real center of power, the armies, the treasury, the diplomatic relationships that the empire ran on. You received something that everyone agreed was culturally important and that would require your brother's permission to do anything meaningful with. You were given a crown and told to be grateful for it. Shamash-Shumukin was not a weak man. The evidence of his reign in Babylon shows a capable administrator who worked to maintain stability and cultivated the Babylonian priestly establishment with genuine skill. He was not someone who would have found subordination easy under any circumstances. And subordination to a brother, to someone you had grown up with, someone who had not been more capable than you, but had simply been given more. That was a specific kind of difficult that the succession treaty seems not to have accounted for. There is a document from Esarhaddon's reign, the actual succession treaty text, that has survived and been studied extensively. If you step back from the technical clauses and read it as a human document, as something that two specific young men were asked to sign and live by. It has a quality that is almost unbearable. It is a father trying to love two sons equally, in a world where equal love produces unequal outcomes. He wanted both of them to be kings. He had enough power to make both of them kings. What he did not have, and what no amount of power could provide, was a way to make both of them feel like kings in the same sense, with the same weight and the same freedom and the same relationship to their own authority. One of them was always going to be the brother who got Assyria. One of them was always going to be the one who got the rest. Esarhaddon died in 669 before the Common Era, on his way to campaign in Egypt. He did not live to see what his decision would produce. He did not live to see Ashurbanipal build his library, or Shamash-shum-ukin burn in his palace, or Nineveh fall to people who would not have been strong enough to challenge it, had the empire not spent years fighting itself. He died believing, as far as we know, that he had solved the problem. He had not solved the problem. He had arranged it into a shape that would take 17 years to fully emerge and another 3 years of siege and fire to resolve. There was a man in Esarhaddon's court who understood this from the beginning. He was a senior administrator who had been involved in drafting the succession arrangements, who had read the treaty text and worked on the practical details of dividing the imperial administration between the two designated heirs. His name appears in records, but his thoughts do not. But here is what the situation would have told anyone with enough experience to read it clearly. The succession treaty tried to be two things at once. It tried to be a statement of equality between the two princes, honoring both of them, giving both of them dignity, and it tried to be a clear hierarchy, making certain that Ashurbanipal's authority was paramount and Shamash-shum-ukin's subordination was legally airtight. A document that tries to be two contradictory things is not a stable document. It is a pressure vessel, and pressure vessels, given enough time and enough pressure, do one thing. They burst. The administrator would have had a choice. He could raise the concern, point to the structural contradiction in what was being built, or he could keep his mouth closed, do his job, and trust that the people above him knew what they were doing. We know what he chose, because if he had successfully raised the concern, the treaty would look different than it does. He kept his mouth closed. That is what people in bureaucracies do when the person making the decision has already decided. You implement, you serve. You hope that the structural problem you can see clearly from your position is not as serious as it looks. This time, it was exactly as serious as it looked. Ashurbanipal was now king. Shamash-shum-ukin was now king, and somewhere between Nineveh and Babylon, in the 400 miles of empire that separated them, something was already beginning, that neither of them could stop, and that their father had not intended, and that would cost both of them more than any war with any foreign enemy ever had. It always costs more when it is family. That is not a political observation. It is just true. Let's get something clear before we go any further. When most people hear the word library, they think of a quiet place, shelves, order, the particular smell of old paper, or in this case, old clay, a place where knowledge is kept safe because someone believed that ideas matter and that the record of human thought deserves to be preserved for its own sake. That is not what Ashurbanipal built. What he built was something considerably more interesting and considerably more ruthless. Understanding the difference between what we imagine when we hear the word library and what Ashurbanipal actually constructed in Nineveh is the key to understanding everything about him. His campaigns, his relationship with Babylon, the way he presented himself to the world, the way he thought about power at the deepest level. The library was a weapon. It just did not look like one. In the Mesopotamian world of the 7th century, before the Common Era, knowledge and power were not two separate categories that occasionally intersected. They were the same category, expressed in different forms. To know something that others did not know was to have something that others needed. To control what was known, what was written, what was preserved, and what was allowed to disappear. That was to control a layer of reality that armies could not reach and walls could not protect. Think about what was actually in the collection. The single largest category of tablets was omen literature. Thousands of tablets recording observations, interpretations, and systematic collections of signs and their meanings. If a particular star appeared in a particular position on a particular night, what did it mean for the king, for the harvest, for military campaigns? If a sheep's liver had a specific mark in a specific location, what was the god communicating? This sounds like superstition to modern ears. It was not superstition in the context of the world that produced it. It was the closest thing that world had to a systematic, empirical science of prediction, built on centuries of recorded observations that priests and scholars had been maintaining and refining since before the Assyrian Empire existed. The omen texts were the accumulated data of a civilization trying to read the patterns in nature and human events and use those patterns to anticipate the future. Anticipating the future was the most valuable thing any advisor could offer any king. So when Ashurbanipal collected omen texts, gathered them from temples across his empire, demanded that local scribal establishments send their best copies to Nineveh, he was not indulging an intellectual hobby. He was centralizing the empire's predictive infrastructure. He was ensuring that the most complete, most authoritative collection of omen knowledge in the world was located in one place, under his name, accessible to his scholars and not to anyone else's. The second major category was ritual texts, instructions for ceremonies, prayers, incantation, the specific procedures for maintaining correct relationships between the human world and the divine one. In Mesopotamian religious practice, the correct performance of ritual was not optional. The gods did not respond to good intentions or sincere belief. They responded to correct procedure. Get the words wrong. Get the sequence wrong. Omit the required offering. And the ritual did not just fail to work. It could actively cause harm, could disrupt the relationship between humanity and the divine order in ways that had consequences for everyone, which meant that whoever had the most complete, most authoritative collection of ritual texts had something that every temple, every city, every community needed. You could not perform the major ceremonies correctly without access to the correct texts. And if Nineveh was the place that had the correct texts, then everyone who needed to perform those ceremonies correctly needed something from Nineveh. This was not a coincidence. This was a feature. The third major category was medical texts. In Mesopotamian medicine, the boundary between what we would call clinical treatment and what we would call religious practice was not where we would draw it. Illness was understood as having both physical and spiritual dimensions, and effective treatment addressed both. The medical corpus contained centuries of accumulated observation about symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments, organized into systematic series that trained physicians used as reference texts. Having the most complete collection meant having something that practitioners across the empire needed. Royal physicians trained in Nineveh, using Nineveh's texts taking Nineveh's medical tradition with them to their postings throughout the empire. Medical knowledge flowed outward from the center, and the center was Ashurbanipal's palace. The fourth category is the one that tends to get the most attention from modern readers, and rightly so, because it connects Ashurbanipal's library most directly to the world we still inhabit. Literary and mythological texts, the great narrative traditions of Mesopotamia, creation stories, flood narratives, royal epics, and most famously, the tablets that contain what we now know as the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest major work of literature in human history that has survived in substantial form. It tells the story of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, a man of superhuman strength and restless ambition who loses his closest companion and is so devastated by the loss that he sets out to find a way to defeat death itself. He travels to the ends of the earth. He finds the man who survived the Great Flood, the only human being ever granted immortality by the gods. He asks him for the secret. He learns that there is no secret, that death is the price of being human, that the gods kept immortality for themselves when they made the world. He goes home. He looks at the walls of his city, walls he built, and understands that this is what remains. The things we make, the memory of the fact that we made them. It is a story about the hardest thing human beings ever have to accept, and it was written down in its earliest forms over 4,000 years ago. The version that most modern translations are based on, the most complete version we have, was found in Ashurbanipal's library. But here is what matters for understanding Ashurbanipal specifically. He did not collect the Epic of Gilgamesh because he was a literary enthusiast who appreciated great narrative. He collected it because it was a text about a great king, a text that had been used for centuries to think about what great kingship meant, a text that placed its protagonist in a tradition of royal heroism, stretching back before memory. To have the authoritative copy of the Gilgamesh epic was to own, in a real sense, the authoritative account of what a great king looked like. You could argue that Ashurbanipal saw himself in Gilgamesh, a man of power and learning, a builder, a king who wanted to be remembered, wrestling with his own mortality and trying to find a way to leave something that would outlast him. The library itself can be read as his answer to Gilgamesh's answer. Not the walls of a city, but the tablets in a palace. Not the record of walls built, but the walls built around knowledge itself. Now here is the part that most accounts of the library leave out, or mention only briefly. Ashurbanipal did not just copy texts that already existed in Nineveh. He took them. There are letters surviving from his reign, written by Ashurbanipal to officials in various cities. And the language in these letters is not the language of a scholar making a polite request. It is the language of a king issuing orders. Find the tablets in your city. Identify the most skilled scribes. Copy everything of value. Send the copies and, in some cases, the originals, to Nineveh. Make sure nothing important is withheld. The word withheld is doing a lot of work in those letters. One of the most studied examples involves Babylon. Ashurbanipal had a complicated relationship with Babylon, which we will get into in detail later. But in terms of the library, Babylon was one of his most important sources. The Babylonian scribal tradition was ancient and extraordinarily sophisticated, in some ways more developed than anything Assyria had produced on its own. Ashurbanipal wanted what Babylon had, and Ashurbanipal was the king of the world, which meant that what Ashurbanipal wanted, Ashurbanipal generally received Scribes in Babylonian temples and private scribal families received the royal directive, copy your holdings, send them to Nineveh. The tablets of Babylon's accumulated centuries of knowledge were catalogued, copied, and transported north to join the growing collection in the palace. Think about what this looked like from the inside of a Babylonian temple. Your institution has maintained these texts for generations. Your family, perhaps, has been part of the scribal tradition for centuries, passing knowledge from teacher to student, building a collection that represents the accumulated intellectual labor of your entire community. The texts are not just information. They are identity. They are the record of who you are and what your community knows and what your community cares about. And now there is a letter from Nineveh that says, copy all of it and send it north. You comply. Because not complying is not a realistic option. But what exactly has happened? Your texts are still there. Technically, copies have been made, but the authoritative center of gravity has shifted. The place that has the most complete collection is no longer your temple. It is the palace in Nineveh, the place that can make the claim of ownership, of royal sanction, of being the official home of this knowledge. That place is now somewhere else. Ashurbanipal put his name on the tablets. Every tablet that entered the library collection was supposed to carry the mark of royal ownership. Palace of Ashurbanipal, King of the world, King of Assyria. He was not just collecting knowledge. He was rebranding it. Knowledge that had belonged to temples, to scribal families, to the accumulated practice of local communities across the empire, was being transformed through the act of collection and labeling into royal knowledge, into Ashurbanipal's knowledge, into something that existed under his authority and reflected his power. This is not how librarians usually talk about libraries, but it is exactly how Ashurbanipal thought about his, and there is something almost modern about it, in a way that can be uncomfortable to sit with. The instinct to gather information to a central location, to label it with the name of the institution that owns it, to make the act of collection itself a demonstration of power, to ensure that anyone who needs access to the most complete version of anything has to come to you, or to the system you control, to get it. The form has changed. The logic has not. There was a scribe in a provincial temple, somewhere in the empire, who received Ashurbanipal's order. His family had maintained that temple's collection for 3 generations. His grandfather had copied some of those tablets. His father had added annotations. He himself had spent years working with texts he knew better than almost anyone. Now he was copying them for someone else. He did it carefully. He did it correctly. He made sure the copies were accurate, because inaccurate copies of ritual texts were worse than no copies at all. He packed the clay tablets in their carrying cases and prepared them for the journey north. And when he handed them to the royal courier, something was transferred that the official documentation did not record. Something that does not appear in Ashurbanipal's palace inscriptions or the cataloguing system of the library or any of the surviving administrative records. His community's claim to those texts, the idea that this knowledge was theirs, rooted in their place, reflecting their tradition, carrying their accumulated understanding of what these texts meant, that did not get copied. That did not travel to Nineveh. That just ended. And the tablets, which carried all the information but none of that context, began the journey north to join the 30,000 others in the palace of the King of the world. There is a gallery in the British Museum in London where you can have an experience that the museum does not advertise and most visitors do not seek out. It happens when you stop treating the objects as museum objects. When you stop reading the labels and stop thinking about the date of acquisition and stop placing the things in front of you in the category of ancient artifacts that belong in the past, and you just look at them the way the people who made them intended them to be looked at, the lion hunt reliefs from Nineveh are among the most powerful works of art produced by any civilization at any point in human history. That is not hyperbole. That is the assessment of people who spend their professional lives looking at art from every culture and every era. The lions are dying. That is the subject. Ashurbanipal is hunting lions, mounted on his chariot, bow drawn, and the lions are dying in various stages of the process. Some are still fighting. One famous image shows a lion rearing up toward the chariot, arrows in its body, still moving, still dangerous, its front paws reaching for something it will not reach. Another shows a lioness dragging herself forward with her back legs paralyzed, arrows in her spine, still pulling herself toward the enemy, still refusing the conclusion that the physical evidence of her situation has already determined. The sculptor looked at dying lions, really looked at them, not at the symbol of a lion, not at the concept of a lion as an emblem of chaos or wildness, at actual lions dying, actual deaths, and recorded what that looked like with a fidelity and a sympathy that goes beyond technical mastery into something harder to name. You can feel the weight of the lioness pulling herself forward. You can feel the effort it costs her. You can feel, looking at stone that is 2,600 years old, the specific quality of a living thing that has not yet accepted the information its body is sending it. And then you look further along the wall, and you see the other reliefs, prisoners being led in chains, enemies being executed, a famous image of a defeated king being forced to kneel at Ashurbanipal's feet during a banquet, displayed as a living trophy, while the king eats and drinks and musicians play, the scenes of military victory rendered with the same technical precision, the same formal beauty, the same controlled aesthetic language that the sculptor brought to the lions, the same hand, the same skill, the same eye, different subjects. In Nineveh itself, this coexistence was the daily texture of the city. Go back to that palace, before the destruction, when the walls still stood and the reliefs were new, and the people who moved through those corridors were living inside the world. Those images described, there was a soldier stationed in Nineveh, part of the garrison that protected the capital. He was competent and experienced and unremarkable, the kind of man that professional armies produce in large numbers, because large armies run on reliability more than on heroism. He knew how to use his weapons. He knew his duties. He did them. Every morning he walked past the palace on his way to his post. The reliefs on the outer walls were visible to him, the carved images of royal power designed to be seen by exactly this kind of person. He had walked past them hundreds of times. He did not stop to look at them anymore. They were part of the landscape of his city, the way the river was part of the landscape, present and enormous and not requiring daily acknowledgement inside the palace. On the other side of the walls, he walked past. A scribe was sitting with a tablet. The scribe was copying a medical text, a series of observations about fever, organized by symptom and followed by recommended treatments. He was making a new clean copy because the original was damaged, and the damaged sections needed to be preserved before they deteriorated further. He did this carefully. Medical texts are among the most copied, most revised, most annotated texts in the library. A wrong word in a treatment protocol means a patient dies. The soldier does not think about the scribe at all. The scribe does not think about the soldier. They exist in the same city, serving the same king, sustaining the same empire, and they will never be in the same room. This is the ordinary texture of Ashurbanipal's Nineveh, the daily reality of a city running at the peak of its civilization, with thousands of people doing the thousands of different things that a city at its peak requires. Most of them not thinking about the king who made the whole thing possible, because the king is the water they swim in, and you do not generally think about water. Now here is the question that the reliefs and the library and the soldier and the scribe all point toward, the question that Ashurbanipal himself embodied more completely than any ruler before him. In the Assyrian understanding of the cosmic order, the king occupied a specific and essential position. He was the point at which divine order entered human reality. His function was to maintain the boundary between cosmos and chaos. Lions were symbols of the chaos the king was ordained to subdue. The lion hunt was a ritual enactment of the king's cosmic function. When Ashurbanipal killed a lion, he was performing, in the visible world, the role the gods had assigned him in the cosmic one. The sculptor who recorded the lion's dying was therefore not recording cruelty. He was recording the correct operation of the universe. And the scenes of defeated enemies, rendered with the same skill, were depicting the same thing. People who resisted Assyrian authority had aligned themselves with chaos. The king's response to them was the restoration of order, the correction of an imbalance, the same cosmic function that the lion hunt performed. In human rather than animal terms, this is a coherent worldview. It is internally consistent. It explains why the same aesthetic language was brought to both sets of images. Both were depicting the same thing, the king maintaining the correct order of the world. It is also a worldview that has been used in various forms to justify the treatment of other human beings throughout history, up to and including the present day. The specifics change. The structure remains the same. We represent order. They represent chaos. Our treatment of them is therefore correction, not cruelty. But go back to the lioness. The sculptor was not required to make her sympathetic. The ideological purpose of the images did not require sympathy. He could have rendered her schematically, symbolically, in the conventional language that ancient art used for things that were symbols rather than subjects. He rendered her as a subject. He looked at her as an individual, a specific animal in a specific moment of a specific death. He gave her weight and effort and the particular dignity of a living thing, fighting against a conclusion it cannot avoid. Why? The most plausible answer is that the sculptor and the king who directed his work recognized something in the lions that the ideological framework of the images was not designed to accommodate. They recognized that the lions were real, that their dying was real, that there was something in the specific quality of a living thing expending its last effort that deserved to be recorded with fidelity rather than reduced to symbol. They saw it, they recorded it, while also recording, with the same fidelity, the scenes that make modern viewers stop. Ashurbanipal commissioned all of it. He walked through those rooms every day of his reign in Nineveh. The dying lion and the kneeling prisoner were part of the same visual landscape, both serving the same argument about the correct order of things. The man who sat in the library and read texts about loss and grief and the search for meaning in human existence also walked through rooms where both of those kinds of images decorated the walls. He did not find this contradictory. That is the most important thing to understand about him. The knowledge in the tablets and the images on the walls and the campaigns in the field were all expressions of the same thing. order, power, the correct arrangement of the world. The texts said it in language. The reliefs said it in stone. The campaigns said it in blood. All of it was the same argument. The library was not separate from the campaigns. The campaigns were not separate from the reliefs. Everything was part of the same project. And outside the palace wall, the soldier completed his morning route and went back to his post. And the city moved around him. And the king read his tablets. And no one asked the question that was sitting in all of it. Quiet and patient and waiting. The question of what the argument could not reach. The question of what knowledge left untouched. The question that was about to walk through the palace gates in the form of a messenger from Babylon. On a morning that began the same as every other morning and ended differently than any of them. There is a city that does not exist anymore. Not in the way that most ancient cities do not exist anymore. Buried under centuries of sediment. Their outlines, visible to archaeologists with the right equipment. Their names preserved in texts, even if their physical remains require excavation to find. Elam's capital, Susa, still exists, in a sense. The modern Iranian city of Shush sits near the same location. There are ruins. There are artifacts in museums. But the civilization that Susa represented, the political and cultural entity called Elam, the thing that had existed as a distinct presence in the ancient Near East for roughly 3,000 years before Ashurbanipal was born, that is gone in a way that goes beyond the ordinary disappearance of ancient states. It was ended deliberately, with intention, by a man who understood what he was doing and recorded it proudly in his own inscriptions. That man was Ashurbanipal, and the story of what he did to Elam, and why, and what he took when he was done, is essential to understanding the library. Elam and Assyria had been in conflict for centuries before Ashurbanipal came to the throne. The relationship between them was one of those ancient regional rivalries that had accumulated so many grievances, so many cycles of aggression and retaliation, so many dynastic insults and broken agreements, that by the 7th century before the Common Era, it had long since passed, the point where anyone on either side could say, with confidence, where it had started, or what a resolution might look like. What they could say was that the other side was the enemy. That had been true for as long as anyone's grandfather could remember. Ashurbanipal had a more specific reason for his campaign against Elam than simple tradition. Elam had been one of the powers that Shamash-Shumukin had reached out to during the early stages of his rebellion. When Ashurbanipal's brother began assembling the coalition that would eventually challenge Nineveh's authority, Elam was on the list of potential allies. The logic was straightforward. Elam was Assyria's traditional enemy. Anyone fighting Assyria had a natural interest in Elam's cooperation. The rebellion happened. The coalition formed. And then, as we will see in detail later, the rebellion failed. After the failure, after Babylon had been taken and Shamash-Shumukin was dead, Ashurbanipal turned his attention to the partners who had supported his brother. Elam was at the top of that list. But the campaign against Elam was not simply punitive. It was something that had been building in Ashurbanipal's strategic thinking for years, and the rebellion gave him the justification he needed to pursue it to its conclusion. The conclusion he had in mind was total. The campaign against Elam, which played out over several years in the 640s before the Common Era, was one of the most systematic destructions of a civilization in the ancient world. Ashurbanipal did not just defeat the Elamite armies. He pursued a policy of deliberate erasure that went far beyond what military victory required. He destroyed Susa. The temples were sacked. The divine statues were carried off to Nineveh. The royal tombs were opened. The bones of Elamite kings dead for centuries were dug up and taken to Assyria, where they would be denied the proper rites that Elamite religion held necessary for the welfare of the dead. He scattered the population. He removed the gods, the ancestors, and the crops in a single coordinated campaign. He recorded all of this himself, in detail, with what reads, across 3 millennia, as genuine satisfaction. He wrote that he made Elam's land quake, that he spread salt and thorns over it, that he destroyed it so thoroughly that even wild animals would not dwell there. He was not describing incidental casualties of a military operation. He was describing the deliberate, systematic elimination of a civilization as a functioning entity. And then, in the same campaign, or in its immediate aftermath, he did something that the military and political records treat as a footnote, but that turns out to matter enormously for the story we are telling. He took the tablets. Susa had its own scribal tradition. Elam had a written language, now lost, that scholars are still working to fully decode. But Susa also contained tablets in Akkadian, the common diplomatic and literary language of the region, texts that had accumulated in Elamite, royal and temple archives over centuries. Some of these tablets were copies of Mesopotamian literary works that circulated across the region, including versions of stories that Ashurbanipal was already collecting in Nineveh. Some were records specific to Elam, administrative and religious documents. Some were texts that existed in Susa because Susa had been a cultural center of real importance, a place where knowledge was valued and preserved. Ashurbanipal took them. Think about what this means when you put it alongside the destruction. He was erasing Elam as a political entity. He was erasing Elam as a religious community by removing its gods and desecrating its royal dead. And he was erasing Elam as a custodian of its own knowledge by taking the texts that represented its intellectual tradition and incorporating them into a collection that bore his name and existed under his authority. The civilization was being ended and simultaneously being absorbed. Its knowledge was being preserved in a form that made Ashurbanipal its new owner. There is something in this that should make us pause before we describe Ashurbanipal's library as an act of cultural preservation, because it was also an act of cultural conquest. The knowledge survived, in the sense that the physical tablets were not destroyed, but the community that had produced that knowledge, that had maintained it, that understood its context and its significance within a living tradition, that community was scattered or killed or reduced to a condition where it could no longer function as a community. The knowledge was separated from the people who knew what it meant. And then it was filed in Nineveh under the label palace of Ashurbanipal, king of the world. Now here is the part that history did not plan, and Ashurbanipal could not have anticipated. Some of the tablets he took from Elam, and some of the tablets already in his collection, contained versions of a story about a great flood. A story about a man warned by the gods that the world was going to be destroyed by water, who built a boat and survived, who watched everything else die and then stepped out onto dry land when the waters receded and started the world again. This story in various forms existed across the ancient Near East. It was one of the oldest narrative traditions in the region, and it appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in what scholars now call the Flood Tablet, which is one of the most famous individual tablets in the British Museum. The specific version of that tablet, the one scholars have studied most intensively, came from Ashurbanipal's library, which came, in part, from Susa, which Ashurbanipal destroyed. The destruction of Elam preserved, accidentally and through a chain of events that no one designed. one of the oldest flood narratives in human history, a text that would later be read alongside the book of Genesis and would reframe the understanding of both texts for everyone who encountered them. Ashurbanipal burned a civilization and saved a story about a flood. He did not mean to save it. He meant to own it, which is a different thing. But the distinction between owning something and saving it has a way of collapsing over 3,000 years. When the civilization that owned it is gone and the tablets remain. There was a man in Susa during the campaign who had spent his professional life with those tablets. Whoever he was, he knew those texts. He had worked with them. He understood their organization, their context, the tradition they represented. He watched Assyrian soldiers carry them out. He may have been one of the people who helped carry them, ordered to assist in his own community's intellectual dispossession. He may have watched from a distance as the library he knew was disassembled and packed for transport north. What he thought, we cannot know. What he felt is not in any record, but what happened to those tablets is in the record, in the sense that the tablets themselves are in the record. They ended up in Nineveh. They were catalogued into Ashurbanipal's collection. They survived the fall of Nineveh. They survived 3,000 years in the ground. They were excavated in the 19th century and shipped to London. The man who watched them being carried out of Susa is dust. His name is nowhere. The tablets are in a museum. This is what Ashurbanipal's library actually is. Underneath the language of royal cultural achievement and the narrative of scholarly king and the story of preserved civilization, it is the accumulated knowledge of a world that Assyria dominated, stripped from the communities that produced it, centralized under royal authority, labeled with a king's name, and then preserved by the catastrophe that ended the king's world. It survived because of fire. The fire that destroyed Nineveh baked the clay tablets hard, transforming fragile dried clay into something much closer to permanent ceramic. The destruction that was supposed to end everything accidentally ensured that the tablets would last. Ashurbanipal was the most powerful man in the world. He destroyed civilizations and collected their knowledge and put his name on all of it and called himself king of the world. And then the world ended his empire, and the fire preserved his library, and the tablets outlasted everything else. He would have found this outcome deeply unsatisfying. History did not ask for his opinion. 17 years is a long time to maintain a fiction. That is how long Ashurbanipal and Shamash-shum-ukin ruled their respective kingdoms before the arrangement their father had designed finally broke open into open conflict. 17 years of formal correspondence. 17 years of ceremonies conducted in both cities, according to their separate but supposedly harmonious traditions. 17 years of a relationship that looked, from the outside and from the official record, like exactly what Esarhaddon had intended it to be. 2 kings. 1 empire. Brothers, ruling in coordination. The official record is misleading in the way that official records always are when produced by people with strong reasons to maintain a particular version of events. Let us get underneath the surface. Shamash-shum-ukin arrived in Babylon as its new king, with whatever combination of pride and apprehension that situation would reasonably produce. He was a son of the Assyrian royal house. He had grown up in Nineveh, in the palace, surrounded by the full apparatus of Assyrian imperial power. He knew what that power looked like from the inside. Now he was in Babylon. Babylon was older than Assyria's dominance. It was, by the standards of the ancient Near East, the most culturally prestigious city in the world. The Babylonian scribal tradition was more ancient than the Assyrian one. The Babylonian priestly establishment maintained rituals that predated the Assyrian Empire by a millennium. The city's sense of its own importance was not arrogance in the pejorative sense. It was history. The people of Babylon had spent decades under Assyrian control and had not, in any meaningful sense, accepted the legitimacy of that control. They accepted its reality. They paid their taxes. They did what people do when they are under the authority of a power they cannot currently resist. But they believed, with the quiet persistence of a tradition that had survived foreign domination before, that Babylon was the real center of civilization and that the current arrangement was an unfortunate historical moment rather than a permanent truth. Into this city came Shamash-shum-ukin, sent to be Babylon's ruler, under terms that everyone in Babylon could read clearly enough. He was Assyria's man in Babylon, except that he was not. Entirely, Shamash-shum-ukin took his responsibilities seriously and worked to govern Babylon competently. He maintained the religious traditions. He performed the ceremonies that the Babylonian priestly establishment required. He showed a respect for Babylonian culture and tradition that went beyond the minimum his position required. Whether this was political calculation or genuine sympathy, or both, the effect was the same. The people of Babylon began to see him not as Assyria's representative but as something closer to their own king, a king who was constrained by his relationship with Nineveh. Yes, but a king who was present, who performed the rituals, who treated Babylonian tradition with something that looked like genuine respect. And Ashurbanipal, watching from Nineveh, was reading a different version of events. The letters that passed between the two brothers have been studied extensively by historians. There is a formality to the exchanges that sometimes slips in ways that are telling. Ashurbanipal's letters to his brother contain, at various points, a tone that occupies the uncomfortable territory between eminence and reproach. He is writing to his brother the way an older sibling writes to a younger one who has been given a responsibility and is being reminded, gently but unmistakably, that the responsibility was given and can be adjusted. Shamash-shum-ukin's responses maintain the required formality. He calls himself his brother's servant. He expresses appropriate deference. He complies. But 17 years of calling yourself your brother's servant. When you are a king, when the city you rule is Babylon, when the people around you are beginning to look at you as something more than Nineveh's representative, changes something. It changes the way water changes stone. Not suddenly, not visibly from one day to the next, but over time, in a direction that cannot be reversed. At some point, during those 17 years, probably not at a single identifiable moment, but through an accumulation of small recognitions, Shamash-shum-ukin understood something. The arrangement was never going to change. This was what the succession treaty's design made structurally impossible to resolve. There was no path within the existing arrangement by which Shamash-shum-ukin could become anything other than what he was. He could govern well. He could be respected in Babylon. He could maintain excellent relations with his brother. And at the end of all of that, he would still be the junior partner, still the one who deferred, still the king whose power was real, within limits set by someone else. And Ashurbanipal was never going to voluntarily change those limits. Not because he was cruel, not because he did not care about his brother, but because changing the limits would mean reducing his own authority, and no king in his position was going to do that voluntarily. The arrangement was stable precisely because it was unequal. Change the inequality, and the stability went with it. Shamash-shum-ukin was intelligent enough to understand this, and, understanding it, he had to make a choice that the succession treaty had, by design, made almost impossible to avoid. He could accept the arrangement for the rest of his life, govern Babylon competently, maintain the fiction of fraternal cooperation, die as the junior partner of a man who had been given more, not because he deserved more, but because he had been born slightly earlier, and their father had decided that slightly earlier was enough. Or he could do something else. The something else began in 652, before the Common Era, approximately 17 years after both brothers had taken their respective thrones. Shamash-shum-ukin began reaching out to the powers surrounding the Assyrian Empire, to Elam, to Arab tribal confederations, to Babylon's own priestly establishment and the network of loyalties that establishment commanded across the region. He was building a coalition, the letters documenting this period, some of which survived and were found in Ashurbanipal's archive, meaning that Ashurbanipal's intelligence operation was monitoring his brother's communications carefully. Show a man who had made his decision and was moving toward it with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that what he was contemplating had to be done right or not at all. He knew what he was starting. He had grown up in the Assyrian court. He understood the military capacity his brother commanded. He knew what Assyrian armies did to cities that rebelled. He also knew that Babylon was not just any city, that if the people of Babylon rose against Nineveh, it would not look to the rest of the region like just another provincial revolt. It would look like the ancient center of civilization, asserting its right to exist on its own terms. He calculated all of this, and then he made the choice. In 652, before the Common Era, Shamash-shum-ukin declared himself independent of Assyrian authority. The fiction of the two kings ruling in harmony was over. There was an official in Babylon during those 17 years, a man who served in the administrative apparatus that Shamash-shum-ukin maintained, who had watched the gradual change in his king with the attentiveness of someone whose professional survival depended on reading the situation correctly. He was not in the inner circle of whatever planning was happening. He was a mid-level functionary, the kind of man that every government depends on to keep the daily business moving. He noticed the change in Shamash-shum-ukin before anyone officially acknowledged that a change was happening. He noticed it in the way the king held himself in certain rooms, in the way certain conversations were allowed to continue that a year earlier would have been redirected, in the way the correspondence with Nineveh took slightly longer to receive responses, and the responses, when they came, had a slightly different quality. He had a family, he had a position, he had a life organized around the city he lived in and the structures that kept it functioning. Whatever was coming, he needed to be on the right side of it when it arrived. The problem was that identifying the right side in advance was genuinely impossible. Ashurbanipal had the larger army. Assyria had more resources. Historically, Assyrian sieges ended in Assyrian victory, but Babylon had the legitimacy. Babylon had the cultural weight. Babylon had the support of powers outside the empire, who had their own reasons to want Assyrian authority weakened. The official did what people in his situation usually do when the right side is genuinely unclear. He waited. He kept doing his job. He processed the documents that came across his desk. He maintained the appearance of normal functioning. He waited to see which way the world was going to fall. He was not alone in this. Most of Babylon was doing the same thing. The rebellion was coming. Everyone could feel it. And no one, except perhaps Shamash-shum-ukin himself, knew exactly what it was going to cost. Sieges are slow. This is the thing that histories of ancient warfare tend to compress. The way films compress it The way the dramatic logic of a story demands that it be compressed. A city is surrounded. There is fighting. The city falls. We move on. The reality of a siege, the lived experience of one, is the opposite of compression. It is time stretched to its most uncomfortable length. It is the same day happening again and again with minor variations, each day slightly worse than the one before it, in a way that is gradual enough to be endurable and comprehensive enough to be destroying. Babylon was under siege for 3 years. 3 years. 1,095 days of the same walls, the same streets, the same faces getting thinner, the same calculus of what remains and how long it can last. 3 years of the city's population making the daily decision that today is not the day to give up. Not because hope is particularly strong, but because the alternative to making that decision is considering what the alternative actually is. The Assyrian army surrounded the city and waited. This was Ashurbanipal's strategy, and it was correct in the cold military logic that sieges operate on. Babylon's walls were formidable. A direct assault would cost Assyrian lives in numbers that were difficult to justify when time would accomplish the same result at a lower price. The city had stores. It had water from the Euphrates, though controlling access to that was part of the siege. But the stores were finite. The population was large. The math of siege warfare is simple and merciless. Food divided by mouths, subtracted by days, equals the moment the city opens its gates, or the moment the city stops being able to function as a city at all. Inside Babylon, Shamash Shumukin was managing something that no amount of political courage or military skill could fully manage. He had made his choice. He had committed to it publicly, irrevocably, in a way that removed all other options from the table. He had declared his independence, raised his coalition, asked the people of Babylon to stand with him against the most powerful military force in the world. And now he was watching the coalition's limitations become visible one by one. Elam, which had been one of the key external supporters he had counted on, was in no position to provide meaningful assistance. Ashurbanipal had campaigned against Elam before the siege began, reducing its capacity to intervene. The Arab confederations that had indicated support were dealing with their own complications. The help that Shamash Shumukin had calculated into his plan was not arriving in the quantities or the forms that the plan required. He was, in the language that military historians use, strategically isolated, which meant that what happened next was going to happen regardless of what he did. The question was not whether Babylon would fall. The question was how long it would take and what condition the city would be in when it did. For the people of Babylon who had not been architects of the rebellion but who were living inside it, this distinction mattered enormously. Every additional month of resistance was another month of deprivation, another reduction in the population's physical condition, another increment of damage to the city's infrastructure and social fabric. The priests who had supported Shamash Shumukin because they believed in Babylon's right to self-determination were watching the city they had wanted to protect suffer the consequences of its protection. This is the particular agony of a siege. The thing you are defending and the act of defending it are in direct conflict. The city suffers because it is being protected. There was a woman in Babylon, part of a family that had lived in the city for multiple generations. Her family's position was modest but stable. Her husband worked in one of the city's commercial sectors. They had children. They had a house. They had the kind of ordinary life that is invisible in official records, because nothing about it was officially remarkable. When the siege began, her family's situation changed in the way that siege situations change. The stores they had accumulated were assessed against the new timeline. The daily calculations that had previously been about sufficiency now became about sustainability. How long would this last? What could be reduced? What was necessary? And what was a habit that necessity was now going to revise? She did not have strong opinions about Shamash-Shumukin's political situation or about the legitimacy of Babylon's claim to independence from Nineveh. These were not her categories. She had opinions about whether her children were eating enough and whether the water from their portion of the city's supply was remaining clean, and whether the Assyrian army outside the walls was going to break through this week or not for another month. Her world shrank. That is what sieges do. They reduce the horizon to the immediate. The question of whether Babylon, as a civilization, was making a principled stand against Assyrian domination became, for her and for most of the people inside the walls, a much smaller question. The question of whether today was going to be manageable. 3 years of this. In Nineveh, Ashurbanipal was governing an empire. This is the thing that tends to get lost in accounts of the siege. The fact that the siege was one item among many in Ashurbanipal's administrative reality. He was not standing outside Babylon's walls watching the days pass. He was in his palace, managing the full complexity of an empire that stretched from Egypt to Elam, dealing with diplomatic correspondence and religious obligations and the ongoing project of the library and the day-to-day demands of a state that did not pause its requirements because the king was dealing with a painful situation. He sent commanders. He received reports. He made decisions. And at some point in each day's business, presumably, there was the awareness of what was happening south of Nineveh, the awareness that his brother was in that city, that the people dying in that siege were dying because of a choice his brother had made, that the city itself, the city whose cultural tradition he had spent years mining for his library, whose scribal heritage he had incorporated into his collection, was being slowly consumed by the logic of the military situation he had created. What did he think about? The honest answer is that we do not know. What exists is the official record, which is the record of a king managing a rebellion, written in the language of kings managing rebellions, measured, purposeful, confident in the outcome. But here is a question worth sitting with. Ashurbanipal had read in his library, in the texts he had collected from across the ancient Near East, the full range of what human beings had written about brothers, about loyalty and betrayal, and the particular intensity of conflict between people who shared blood. He had read the Gilgamesh epic, which is partly a story about the relationship between two beings who are closer to each other than either is to anyone else, and the cost of losing that closeness. He had read texts that explored, in the complex literary tradition of Mesopotamia, what it meant to be bound to someone by family and separated from them by circumstance. He had read all of this, and it had not given him a way to read the situation with his brother that produced a different outcome. The knowledge in the tablets, the accumulated wisdom of a civilization's literary tradition, did not translate into the kind of understanding that would have allowed him to see Shamash-Shumukin's perspective clearly enough to find a path that did not end in a siege. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is something else. Something that goes to the heart of what the library was and was not. The library was a collection of knowledge. Knowledge about medicine, about astronomy, about ritual, about the patterns in natural phenomena, about the stories that human beings had told themselves about what life meant. It was a remarkable collection. It represented the best of what his civilization had accumulated. But knowledge of the world and understanding of a specific person are different things. You can read every text ever written about the psychology of resentment and still not see the resentment building in the person sitting across from you at dinner. You can study every recorded case of political rebellion and still miss the moment when someone, you know personally, crosses the line from frustration into commitment. Ashurbanipal had 30,000 tablets. He did not have a way to read his brother. Or perhaps he had a way to read him and chose not to. Perhaps he understood at some level what was building in Babylon and calculated that the cost of addressing it proactively, which would have meant fundamentally renegotiating the terms of the arrangement, was higher than the cost of letting it come to a head. We cannot know. What we know is what happened. In 648 before the Common Era, Babylon fell, the city that had held for 3 years, that had resisted with the particular stubbornness of a place that understood its own cultural significance and was not prepared to yield it without making the cost of taking it as high as possible. That city finally reached the end of what it could sustain. The Assyrian forces entered, and Shamash-shum-ukin, rather than surrender, rather than walk out of his palace and kneel before the brother who had besieged him, rather than accept whatever terms Ashurbanipal would have offered, made a final choice. He gathered his household into the palace, and he set it on fire. He burned himself alive in the palace of Babylon rather than submit to his brother's authority. This was not an impulsive act. It was not the panicked decision of a man who had suddenly found himself with no options. It was, by every indication the evidence provides, a deliberate and considered choice made by a man who had been thinking about what the end of this story would look like for a long time. He understood that surrender meant living as what the treaty had always said he was, the junior partner, the brother who got Babylon. The king who called himself his brother's servant. He understood that there was one thing his brother's power could not take from him. The manner of his ending. He chose the fire. In Nineveh, Ashurbanipal received the news. The city had fallen. The rebellion was over. His brother was dead. What the official record says is that the rebellion was crushed. That order was restored. That the gods had confirmed the righteousness of Ashurbanipal's cause by delivering victory. What the official record does not say is anything about what it cost the man who received that news to hear it, because some costs are not the kind that get written on tablets. There is a question that the death of Shamash-shum-ukin leaves permanently open. What did he mean by it? This sounds like a strange question. People who die in fires set by themselves in palaces under siege have their meaning reasonably well established by the circumstances. He chose death over surrender. He refused to submit. He made the only autonomous decision remaining to him when all other decisions had been removed. That is the military historian's answer. And it is correct as far as it goes. But it does not go far enough. Because Shamash-shum-ukin was not making a statement to military historians. He was making a statement to one specific person. The person outside the walls, the person who had, for 3 years, maintained the siege that made this the only remaining choice. His brother, and what he was saying to his brother, with the fire, is something that Ashurbanipal had to live with for the rest of his reign, because there was no response available to him. You cannot answer a fire. You cannot negotiate with ash. You cannot send a letter to someone who chose burning over reading your letters. The fire was Shamash-shum-ukin's final word in a conversation that had been going on for 17 years. And that word said, "I would rather end than continue on your terms." Now, think about what this meant for the man who had built his power on the premise that there were always terms, that every situation had a resolution that could be administered, managed, controlled, that the king, who had the most complete picture of the world, who had gathered the most knowledge, who had the most comprehensive understanding of how things worked, could find a way to manage any situation that presented itself. The library was, among other things, an argument that knowledge was sufficient, that with enough information, with the right texts and the right scholars and the right interpretive frameworks, you could understand anything and therefore manage. Shamash Shum Yukin's fire was a rebuttal to that argument. There was no text in Ashurbanipal's library that would have told him how to make his brother accept an arrangement that his brother found unbearable. There was no omen interpretation, no ritual, no diplomatic formula that would have resolved the fundamental problem that Esarhaddon had built into the succession. The knowledge that Ashurbanipal had spent years accumulating was exquisitely equipped to address a wide range of problems. It was not equipped to address this one, because this one was not a problem of information. It was a problem of dignity, and dignity is not something that can be resolved by the person who took it. Picture the night after the news arrived in Nineveh. Ashurbanipal had been king for over 2 decades. He had campaigned across the ancient world. He had built the most comprehensive library in the history of the ancient Near East. He had managed the internal dynamics of an empire that stretched from Egypt to Iran. He had made decisions that cost thousands of lives, and made those decisions with the composed authority that his position required. But that night, after the messengers had come and gone, and the official responses had been dictated, and the administrative machinery of victory had begun its work, there was a moment when all of that fell away. He was in the palace. The rooms were lit by oil lamps. Outside, Nineveh was going about the business of celebrating a victory, because empires celebrate when rebellions end, because the machinery of the state requires that kind of performance from everyone, including the king. And Ashurbanipal sat with what the victory had actually cost. His brother had chosen fire over him, specifically over him, over the life that Ashurbanipal had arranged, over the world as Ashurbanipal understood it, with its correct order and its divine sanction and its 30,000 tablets explaining how things were supposed to work. Shamash Shum Yukin had looked at all of that and chosen to end rather than continue inside it. What do you do with that? The library was in the next wing of the palace. The tablets were there, in their organized rows, bearing his name, containing the accumulated wisdom of his civilization. He had read texts about loss. He had read the Gilgamesh epic, which is specifically a story about a man who cannot find a way to live inside the world after the person closest to him is gone. He had read lament poetry of extraordinary emotional complexity. He had read everything his civilization had produced on the subject of grief and what it means to be left behind. He had read all of it, and none of it had prepared him for the specific texture of this, the way the room felt, the way the official language of victory sat in his chest like something solid and cold, the particular silence that opens up when the person who knew you before you were what the world decided you were is gone, and you understand, for the first time, at the level of the body rather than the level of the mind, that no one left in your world knew you before that. He was the king of the world. He was alone in the way that people are alone when the last witness to who they were before power found them has chosen the fire. He kept collecting. He kept putting his name on things. Palace of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria. The rooms filled. The collection became what it had been designed to become. And, somewhere in it, if you knew where to look, there were texts about grief, about loss, about the specific human experience of being left behind by someone who chose to go. He had read them. He kept them anyway. He kept everything. There is a gallery in the British Museum where you can stand and look at two things at once. And if you look at them long enough, they will stop making sense in the way they made sense before you walked in. The lion hunt reliefs from Nineveh are among the most powerful works of art produced by any civilization at any point in human history. That is not hyperbole. That is the assessment of people who spend their professional lives looking at art from every culture and every era. The reliefs stop them too. We talked about these reliefs in an earlier chapter, in the context of Nineveh's daily life, but we need to come back to them now. Here, after Babylon, after the fire, because what they show has a different weight when you carry what you now know about the man who commissioned them. The lions are dying. Ashurbanipal is on his chariot, bow drawn, and the lions are dying in various stages of the process. Some are still fighting. One famous image shows a lion rearing up toward the chariot, arrows in its body, still moving, still dangerous, its front paws reaching for something it will not reach. Another shows a lioness dragging herself forward with her back legs paralyzed, arrows in her spine, still pulling herself toward the enemy, still refusing the conclusion that the physical evidence of her situation has already determined. The sculptor looked at dying lions, really looked at them, not at the symbol of a lion, not at the concept of a lion as an emblem of chaos or wildness or the forces that the king was ordained to subdue, at actual lions dying actual deaths, and recorded what that looked like with a fidelity and a sympathy that goes beyond technical mastery into something harder to name. You can feel the weight of the lioness pulling herself forward. You can feel the effort it costs her. You can feel, looking at stone that is 2,600 years old, the specific quality of a living thing that has not yet accepted the information its body is sending it. And then you look further along the wall, prisoners being led in chains, enemies being executed. A famous image of a defeated king being forced to kneel at Ashurbanipal's feet during a banquet, displayed as a living trophy while the king eats and drinks and musicians play. The scenes of military victory rendered with the same technical precision, the same formal beauty, the same controlled aesthetic language that the sculptor brought to the lions, the same hand, the same skill, the same eye, different subjects. Now here is the question, the relief's force, the question that carries full weight only after everything we have been through in this story. The man who commissioned these reliefs had, by the time the sculptors were finishing their work, already lived through the siege of Babylon. He had already received the news about his brother. He had already sat in that room in Nineveh with what the victory had actually cost. He was, at the time, the most celebrated of these reliefs were being completed. A man who had experienced the specific loss of watching someone choose fire over the life you arranged for them, and he had scenes of military triumph carved into the walls of his palace with the same aesthetic language that produced the dying lioness. We need to sit with this, not resolve it. Sit with it, in the Assyrian understanding of the cosmic order, which Ashurbanipal had absorbed not just as political ideology, but as genuine belief. The king occupied a specific and essential position. He was the point at which divine order entered human reality. His function was to maintain the boundary between cosmos and chaos. Lions were not merely animals in this framework. They were symbols of the chaos the king was ordained to subdue. The lion hunt was a ritual enactment of the king's cosmic function. When Ashurbanipal killed a lion, he was performing, in the visible world, the role that the gods had assigned him in the cosmic one. The sculptor who recorded the lions dying was therefore not recording cruelty. He was recording the correct operation of the universe. And the scenes of defeated enemies rendered with the same skill were depicting the same thing. Enemies who resisted Assyrian authority had aligned themselves with chaos. The king's response to them was the restoration of order, the performance of the same cosmic function that the lion hunt performed. In human rather than animal terms, this is a coherent worldview. It is internally consistent. It explains why the same aesthetic language was brought to both sets of images. It is also a worldview that has been used, in various forms, to justify the treatment of other human beings throughout history, up to and including the present day. The specifics change. The structure remains the same. We represent order. They represent chaos. Our treatment of them is therefore correction. Sitting with that recognition is uncomfortable. It should be. But here is what makes the reliefs more complicated than a straightforward study of ancient political theology. Go back to the lioness. The sculptor was not required to make her sympathetic. The ideological purpose of the images did not require sympathy. A lion that was simply an emblem of chaos being subdued by a king who was an emblem of order could have been rendered schematically, symbolically, in the formal, conventional language that ancient art used for things that were symbols rather than subjects. He rendered her as a subject. He looked at her as an individual, a specific animal in a specific moment of a specific death. He gave her weight and effort and the particular dignity of a living thing, fighting against a conclusion it cannot avoid. Why? The most honest answer is that the sculptor and the king who directed the sculptor's work recognized something in the lions that the ideological framework of the images was not designed to accommodate. They recognized that the lions were real, that their dying was real, that there was something in the specific quality of a living thing expending its last effort that deserved to be recorded with fidelity rather than reduced to symbol. They could see it. They chose to record it. Now here is the thing that the reliefs ask you to do, the thing that is genuinely difficult. Hold both of those truths at the same time. The sculptor who saw the lioness clearly enough to carve her dying with that quality of attention, and the ideological system that organized the same visual vocabulary around the subjugation of human beings who had chosen the wrong side of the cosmic order. Ashurbanipal held both of those truths. He walked through the corridors of his palace, and the dying lioness and the kneeling prisoner were part of the same visual landscape, both serving the same argument about the correct order of things. After Babylon, after the fire, after the night, he sat alone with what the victory had cost. He still walked through those corridors. He still saw both sets of images. He still called himself the king of the world. And here is the thing that 26 centuries of distance makes visible that the people inside that world could not have seen from where they stood. The sculptor gave the lioness a dignity that the ideological framework of the images was not designed to provide. He did it anyway, with the same hand that carved the prisoners in chains. That gap between what the framework said and what the eye actually saw when it looked carefully at a living thing in the act of dying. That gap is not unique to ancient Assyria. It is the gap that exists in every system of power that has ever organized human life around categories of who deserves full recognition and who does not. The gap is always there. People always see across it, at least sometimes, with at least some of the things they are looking at. What they do with what they see is the question that the reliefs do not answer. They just ask it. In stone, 2,600 years of people standing in front of that stone and feeling something true about the cost of dying. and walking back out into a world that has never fully solved the problem the stone is pointing at, Ashurbanipal had the most sophisticated knowledge infrastructure in the ancient world. He had read everything his civilization had produced about the nature of power and the nature of loss and the nature of living things in the act of dying. He still walked through those corridors. He still commissioned both sets of images. He still put his name on everything. And the lioness still pulls herself forward. In stone. In London. In the grey light that falls through the museum windows. Still refusing to stop. Still not yet arrived at the conclusion her body has already reached. That is Ashurbanipal. Right there. In the gap between what the eye sees and what the framework says, between what the knowledge contains and what the knowledge cannot reach, between the man who read everything and the man who could not read his brother. The reliefs are not a contradiction. They are a portrait. At the peak of Ashurbanipal's reign, a man could stand in Memphis, Egypt, and know that he was living inside the same empire as a man standing in Susa, in what is now southwestern Iran. That distance, from the Nile Delta to the Iranian plateau, is roughly 2,000 miles. The Assyrian Empire under Ashurbanipal was not the largest empire the world would ever see, but in the 7th century before the Common Era, in the world that existed then, it was something that had not existed before in quite that form, a single political authority, administered from a single city, reaching across an expanse of territory that contained within it Egyptian civilization, Babylonian civilization, Phoenician trading cities, Arab nomadic confederations, and dozens of smaller political entities, all of them organized, in theory, under the authority of one king in Nineveh. In theory, the gap between theory and practice is where empires actually live, and the gap in Ashurbanipal's empire was, by the later years of his reign, becoming something that even the most carefully constructed royal inscriptions could not entirely paper over. Egypt first. Ashurbanipal had not conquered Egypt himself. His father Esarhaddon had done that, taking Memphis in 671 before the Common Era in one of the most ambitious military operations Assyria ever attempted. Esarhaddon died before he could fully consolidate the conquest. Ashurbanipal inherited it and spent the first decade of his reign dealing with the consequences. The consequences were, primarily, that Egypt did not want to be an Assyrian province. Egypt had been an independent civilization for roughly 2,000 years by the time Assyrian soldiers arrived on the Nile. Its sense of its own identity, its religious tradition, its understanding of the correct relationship between its land and its gods and its rulers. None of this was compatible with subordination to a king in Nineveh. The Egyptians had a category for foreign rulers. They called them by a word that implied they were temporary, that they did not fit the structure of the universe as the Egyptians understood it, that they would pass, and then Egypt would continue. Ashurbanipal dealt with two major revolts in Egypt during his reign, both involving local rulers who had their own networks of support and their own capacity to organize resistance. He suppressed both revolts with the military efficiency that Assyria brought to suppression. He installed governors. He garrisoned the major cities. He demonstrated, repeatedly, that the military cost of rebellion was higher than Egypt could currently sustain, and then Egypt drifted anyway. Not in the dramatic way of a full military uprising, in the quiet way of a place that understands that the power controlling it has limits that time will eventually make visible. The local rulers that Ashurbanipal had installed to manage Egypt on his behalf began, slowly, to operate as something more independent than Nineveh intended. They maintained formal acknowledgement of Assyrian authority while functionally becoming autonomous. They cultivated local loyalty. They made decisions without consulting Nineveh. Ashurbanipal eventually stopped campaigning in Egypt. Whether this was a calculated strategic decision to focus resources elsewhere, or a recognition that the cost of maintaining tight control over a territory that far from the center was not worth the return, or simply a function of the increasing demands on his attention from problems closer to home like the rebellion of his brother, the result was the same. Egypt drifted out of effective Assyrian control and never came back. He planted the seed of Egypt's independence by trying to control it. The local governors he appointed to manage Egypt for Nineveh built their own authority in the process of managing, and that authority eventually became the 26th dynasty of Egyptian history, a dynasty that traced its legitimacy to the very administrators Ashurbanipal had trusted with his empire's western anchor. Now, Arabia, the Arab confederations occupying the desert territories to the south and east of the settled regions of Mesopotamia, were a different kind of problem than Egypt. They were not a concentrated civilization with a fixed capital and a priestly establishment and a millennia-old sense of cultural identity. They were mobile, dispersed, organized around kinship networks rather than territorial boundaries, and therefore not amenable to the garrison and governor approach that Assyria used to control conquered urban populations. You cannot garrison a desert, or more precisely, you can, but the garrison will not accomplish what you need a garrison to accomplish, which is to make the presence of your authority felt by everyone in the territory all the time. Mobile populations move around the garrison. They operate in the spaces between the points of control. They raid, they trade, they form and dissolve alliances on timelines that fixed administrative structures cannot track. Ashurbanipal campaigned in Arabia multiple times. He won, in the sense that Assyrian forces defeated Arab forces in the engagements that took place. He extracted tribute. He installed tribal leaders who were nominally loyal to Nineveh, and then the tribal leaders changed or died or reconsidered their loyalty, and the situation required another campaign. This was not a failure of strategy. It was a structural limitation. The kind of control that Assyria was designed to exercise could not be effectively applied to the kind of society that the Arab confederations represented. The tools did not fit the problem. What both Egypt and Arabia illustrate, when you look at them together, is something about the nature of Ashurbanipal's empire at its peak that the royal inscriptions naturally did not emphasize. The peak was also the edge, at the moment when Assyrian power extended furthest, from the Nile to the Iranian plateau. The mechanisms that made the empire function were also approaching the limits of what they could sustain. The supply chains were longer. The communication delays were greater. The local administrators were further from the center and more capable of independent action. Because they had to be. Nobody in Nineveh could manage Egypt in real time from 2,000 miles away. Ashurbanipal understood this. His correspondence demonstrates a king who was paying attention to the details of administration in a way that many rulers of large territories did not bother to do. But understanding a structural problem and solving it are different things. The structural problem of how to govern a territory that has grown beyond the effective reach of centralized control is one that no ancient empire solved, because the tools for solving it did not yet exist. There was a governor in a province at the edge of the empire, somewhere in the middle distance of the imperial periphery, who understood this before Nineveh did. He was not a rebel. He had no desire for confrontation with the Assyrian military machine. He was simply a man in a position of local authority who was paying attention to the gap between what Nineveh said and what Nineveh did, and who was adjusting his behavior accordingly. He still paid his tribute. He still sent the required reports. He still performed the administrative rituals that acknowledged Assyrian authority. But the decisions he made without consulting Nineveh were increasing in number and in significance. Not dramatically, incrementally, in the way that authority devolves when the center cannot maintain the attention required to prevent it. He was not betraying the empire. He was adapting to its actual operating reality. Now here is the thing about the library that becomes visible from this vantage point. Ashurbanipal was building the library during the same years that he was managing the structural limitations of his empire's reach. The two projects were happening simultaneously, in the same reign, funded by the same treasury, directed by the same intelligence, and they were responses to the same problem, the problem of how to maintain control of a world that keeps threatening to exceed the mechanisms available for controlling it. The army was one answer, the most obvious answer, the answer that most empires stopped at. The library was another answer. The idea that if you centralized not just the military and administrative apparatus of the empire, but its knowledge infrastructure, its interpretive frameworks, its understanding of how things worked and what the gods required, you created a kind of control that was not limited by the physical reach of your armies. If all the omen texts were in Nineveh, then the authoritative interpretation of what the omens meant came from Nineveh. If all the royal historical records were in Nineveh, then the authoritative account of who had the right to rule and on what basis came from Nineveh. If all the ritual texts were in Nineveh, then the correct procedure for maintaining the gods' favor came from Nineveh. The king who had all the knowledge had the argument that the world was organized correctly and that Assyria was the proof of that organization and that Ashurbanipal was the person the gods had placed at the center of it. But the failed campaigns in Egypt, the endlessly recurring problem of Arabia, the quietly devolving authority at the empire's edges, all of it was demonstrating at the same time that arguments have limits too. You can control what is written in the texts. You can control which texts are copied and where they are kept and whose name appears at the top of them. You can create the most comprehensive knowledge infrastructure in the ancient world. But you cannot control what happens in the space between a province and its center when the center is 2,000 miles away and the local situation requires a decision today. You cannot control a desert from a library in Nineveh. The empire had reached the edge of what any empire of its era could sustain. And Ashurbanipal, the most comprehensively educated king in Assyrian history, the man who had read more and collected more and thought harder about the relationship between knowledge and power than any ruler before him, was beginning, in the later years of his reign, to encounter the specific limit that all of that could not transcend. The limit of scale, the limit of what one center, however powerful, however comprehensively informed, could actually hold. He kept collecting. He kept adding to the library. He kept sending orders to provincial scribal establishments, demanding copies of texts. The empire kept stretching. The edges kept drifting. The tablets kept filling, and somewhere in the vast administrative machinery of the Assyrian state, the structural crack that had been present since the empire reached its maximum extension was widening, slowly, invisibly, in the way that structural cracks always widen before they become visible to the people whose buildings they are in. He built the library to control the world. The world had already started moving past his ability to hold it. The tablets did not tell him that. There was no tablet for that. Ashurbanipal simply stops, not in a way that the historical record marks with any ceremony, not with a battle death or a documented illness or a court crisis that the surviving texts allow us to trace to a conclusion. The man who had been one of the most documented rulers in the ancient world, whose campaigns and building projects and religious activities and library acquisitions had generated an extraordinary volume of written record. That man reaches a point in the administrative documentation of his reign and then is no longer there. The last firmly dated reference to Ashurbanipal as a living, reigning king comes from around 627 before the Common Era. After that, the record goes quiet in the specific way that records go quiet when the person generating them has stopped generating them. He was probably somewhere in his 50s. By the standards of the ancient world, that was not a young death. By the standards of the Assyrian royal house, which had produced kings who campaigned into their 60s, it was not particularly old either. He had reigned for roughly 42 years, one of the longer reigns in Assyrian history, long enough that the empire he was leaving behind had been shaped by his presence for so long that his absence would itself be a kind of catastrophe. But the absence arrived without announcement. Think about what this means for a man who had spent his entire reign managing how he was seen. Every inscription was calculated. Every relief was designed. Every royal title. Every divine epithet. Every formula of the official record was part of the sustained performance of what Ashurbanipal wanted the world to understand about Ashurbanipal. He was the king of the world. He was the favorite of the gods. He was the shepherd of his people, the destroyer of enemies, the collector of knowledge, the maintainer of correct order. He had put his name on 30,000 clay tablets, and then he disappeared from the record without putting his name on the manner of his ending. The man who had controlled the narrative of his own reign so comprehensively, who had commissioned the reliefs and dictated the inscriptions and directed the scribes and managed the image of himself that the empire received. That man did not get to manage this part. Nobody does. That is the thing that no amount of royal power has ever changed. But there is something particularly pointed about it in Ashurbanipal's case. He had built his entire project on the premise that knowledge was control, that the person who managed the information managed the reality. And at the end of his reign, the most basic information about what happened to him is simply not available. We do not know where he died. We do not know what killed him. We do not know whether the end was sudden or prolonged, whether he was aware of what was happening or whether it took him by surprise, whether there was time for the kind of preparation that a king of his theological understanding would have wanted, or whether preparation was not an option. We do not know whether anyone was with him. The library contains texts about death. Many of them. Mesopotamian civilization had thought deeply and written extensively about what death was and what it meant and what, if anything, came after it. The library contained lament poetry of extraordinary emotional complexity. It contained ritual texts designed to ease the transition between life and death. It contained the Gilgamesh epic, which is in large part a meditation on the fact that death is the one thing that cannot be escaped or negotiated or transcended, regardless of how powerful or how wise or how beloved the person facing it happens to be. Ashurbanipal had read all of this. It did not exempt him from any of it. There is something in this that goes beyond irony. The man who collected all the knowledge his civilization had produced about death faced death with no more resources than the people who had produced that knowledge. The texts did not grant the person who owned them any special access to the answers they were reaching for. They were just texts. They recorded what human beings had thought and felt and imagined. They did not change what human beings experienced when the experience arrived. Knowing everything your civilization has thought about a thing is not the same as being able to face the thing differently than anyone else. This is worth sitting with, because Ashurbanipal's entire project was built on the premise that knowledge was a form of power that transcended the limitations of other kinds of power, that armies could be defeated, but texts could not, that the person who controlled the information controlled something more durable than territory or wealth or military force, and then he died. Probably, the way most people died in the ancient world, of something that his best physicians could not address with the medical texts in his library, or of the accumulated toll of a 42-year reign that had included campaigns and crises and the siege of Babylon and the death of his brother and the management of an empire stretching from Egypt to Iran, or of something entirely ordinary that the historical record had no reason to preserve, because the historical record was not interested in ordinary things happening to extraordinary people. The extraordinary person and the ordinary death, that is the combination that the record gives us, or rather the combination it implies by refusing to give us anything more specific. Now think about what happened to the empire in the years immediately following his disappearance from the record, because what happened tells you something important about what Ashurbanipal had actually built versus what he had believed he was building. He had believed, or at least had acted as though he believed, that the structures he created would outlast him. The library was the clearest expression of this belief. You do not spend decades collecting 30,000 clay tablets and putting your name on all of them if you are not thinking about what happens after you are gone. You do not commission stone reliefs of a quality that you know will survive the wooden furniture and the fabric decorations and the organic materials of daily life if you are not thinking about duration. You do not organize the omen texts and the medical texts and the ritual texts and the literary texts into a systematic collection if you are not thinking about the people who will need to use that collection in the future. He was thinking about the future, but he was thinking about it in the way that powerful people tend to think about the future, which is as an extension of the present. The structures that exist now will continue to exist. The people who know how to use these resources will continue to know. The empire that currently operates according to these systems will continue to operate according to them, with adjustments and improvements, but without fundamental disruption. That is not what happened. Within roughly 2 decades of Ashurbanipal's death, the Assyrian Empire ceased to exist. Not gradually, not through the slow erosion that Rome experienced over centuries, not through a transformation into something else that historians debate whether to call decline or change. It ceased to exist with a comprehensiveness and a speed that shocked the ancient world and has puzzled historians ever since. The Babylonians, under a new dynasty that had risen after the fall of Shamash-shum-ukin, allied with the Medes, a power from the Iranian plateau that Assyria had fought and contained for generations. The coalition moved against Nineveh. They besieged it. In 612, before the Common Era, roughly 15 years after Ashurbanipal's last documented appearance in the record, they took it, and then they destroyed it, not occupied it, not repurposed it as the capital of the new order, the way that most conquering powers treated the major cities they captured, because major cities were assets, and assets were worth maintaining. They destroyed Nineveh with a thoroughness that suggests the destruction was deliberate, was intended to be total, was a statement about what needed to be done to this specific city. The walls came down, the palace came down, the temples came down. The city that had been the center of the ancient world's most powerful empire was reduced to rubble. The relief that accompanied Nineveh's fall was not, by the accounts we have from surrounding civilizations, entirely muted. Some of those accounts read like people describing the ending of something they had feared for a very long time. There is a passage in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Nahum, written around the time of Nineveh's fall, that describes the destruction with a satisfaction that tells you something about how the city had been experienced by the people it dominated. The author describes Nineveh as a city of blood, full of lies and plunder, and then he asks a question that was clearly rhetorical in the context of the original writing, but that takes on a different quality across the distance of 26 centuries. Where is the lion's den? The lion, the image that Ashurbanipal had used to represent himself on those extraordinary reliefs, the king as lion, the maintainer of order, the subduer of chaos. Where is the lion's den now? Gone, ash and rubble, and the memory of something that had been powerful and was now only a cautionary story about the limits of power. Ashurbanipal had read texts about the fall of great cities. His library contained lament literature from centuries earlier, poems about the destruction of Ur and Nippur, the great cities of the Sumerian world that had fallen to various conquerors in the centuries before Assyria rose to prominence. He had read those texts. He had collected them. He had put his name on them. He had not imagined that he was adding to a genre that would eventually include Nineveh. Nobody ever does. The site of Nineveh became, within a few centuries, a mound of dirt beside the Tigris River that travelers passed without recognizing the city that had been the capital of the world's most powerful empire, the city that Ashurbanipal had filled with reliefs and inscriptions and a library of 30,000 tablets, became a mound of dirt that people walked past without knowing what was underneath. For 2,400 years, he had wanted to control the future. The future had simply buried him, and then waited. Here is something that fire does that most people do not know. Fire destroys. That is what fire does. It converts organic material to ash. It weakens structural members until they fail. It turns wood and fabric and leather and everything else that human beings make their daily lives from into smoke and residue. A fire hot enough and sustained enough will destroy almost anything that human beings have ever built. Almost. Clay is different. Clay, in its natural state, is a malleable material. You can shape it. You can press marks into it. You can record on it whatever you want to record. But it is also fragile. Dried clay. Clay that has simply been left in the air to harden. Is brittle. It breaks. It crumbles. It does not survive the weight of collapsed buildings or the passage of centuries without significant damage, unless you fire it in a kiln. Clay transforms. The heat drives out moisture and changes the crystalline structure of the material at a molecular level, creating a substance that is harder and more chemically stable than dried clay. Fired clay, pottery, ceramic, can survive for thousands of years. It survives moisture. It survives pressure. It survives within limits. The kind of mechanical stress that collapsed buildings impose on the objects inside them. The tablets in Ashurbanipal's library were not fired clay. They were the other kind, dried and pressed into shape, inscribed with a stylus, left to harden in the air. They were reasonably durable objects for their context, but not the kind of material that anyone would have selected if they had wanted to preserve something for 3,000 years. And then Nineveh burned, the fire that destroyed the palace, that brought down the walls and the roofs and everything else that made up the physical reality of the greatest city of the ancient world. That fire entered the rooms where the tablets were stored, and it did what fire does to clay that has only been air-dried. It fired it. The tablets that had been fragile and vulnerable became, in the heat of the destruction of their city, something considerably more durable than they had been before. The fire that was supposed to end everything was simultaneously, accidentally, preserving the one thing that would carry Ashurbanipal's name and his civilization's knowledge into the future. This is not a metaphor. It is a material fact of chemistry and temperature, and the specific nature of clay as a recording medium. The destruction of Nineveh is the reason we have the tablets. If Nineveh had simply been abandoned, if the population had drifted away and the buildings had gradually been stripped of their usable materials, and the site had quietly subsided into the agricultural landscape, the way that most abandoned ancient sites do, the tablets would have deteriorated over centuries into fragments too small and too damaged to be useful. Instead, they were fired, and then they were buried under the rubble of the collapsed palace, which protected them from the weather and from the activity of later populations who might have disturbed them, and they sat there, in the dark, for 2,400 years. Think about what was happening in the world during those 2,400 years. While the tablets lay under the rubble of Nineveh, the Babylonian Empire that had helped destroy the city rose and then fell to the Persians. The Persian Empire rose and fell to Alexander. Alexander's successors divided his conquests and then gradually lost them to Rome and to the Parthians. Rome rose and divided, and its western half fell to peoples whose names the Romans had considered barbaric. The eastern half continued as something called Byzantium until it fell to the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire rose and eventually contracted under the pressures of the 19th and 20th centuries. The tablets did not participate in any of this. They were in the ground, above them. The site of Nineveh became a low mound beside the Tigris. Across the river, from a city that would eventually be called Mosul, local people knew the mound was there. They had always known it was there. There were traditions associating the site with ancient greatness. With the Jonah of the Hebrew Bible, who was said to have preached in Nineveh, with a past so distant that its specific content had dissolved into legend. But nobody knew what was under the mound. Nobody knew about the tablets. In 1845 of the Common Era, a British diplomat and adventurer named Austin Henry Layard arrived at the mound called Kuyunjik and began digging. Layard was not a trained archaeologist in the modern sense, because the modern discipline of archaeology did not yet exist in the form we would recognize. He was a man of considerable intelligence and genuine curiosity who had spent years traveling in the Ottoman Empire and had become convinced that the mounds scattered across the landscape of what is now Iraq contained the remains of the civilizations described in the Bible and in the Greek and Roman histories he had grown up reading. He was right. He began excavating Kuyunjik in 1845, and what he found exceeded anything he had anticipated. The palace of Ashurbanipal was under that mound. The walls were down, but the foundations were there, and carved into the stone panels that had once stood upright to form the palace corridors, preserved by their own weight and by the rubble that had buried them, were the reliefs, the lion hunt, the military campaigns, the prisoners, the banquet scene, the dying lioness dragging herself forward on paralyzed legs. Layard had them cut from the walls and shipped to London. That is its own story, with its own complications about what it means to remove objects from the ground of one country and install them in a museum in another. Complications that were not much considered in 1845, but are considered now and have not been resolved. The reliefs are in London. The government of Iraq has requested their return. The conversations continue. The story we are here for happened a few years after Layard's initial excavations, when his assistant, Hormuzd Rassam, made the discovery that changed everything. Rassam was born in Mosul, across the Tigris from the mound of Kuyunjik. In 1826 of the Common Era, He was an Assyrian Christian, part of a community that had maintained a continuous presence in the region since antiquity, a community that knew the landscape and its history in the way that only people who have lived in a place across many generations can know it. He became Layard's assistant, and then, when Layard returned to England and eventually left archaeology behind, Rassam continued the excavations. It was Rassam who excavated the North Palace at Nineveh. It was Rassam who directed the workers, who supervised the removal of the tablets, who understood from the beginning that what was coming out of the ground was of extraordinary importance, even before anyone in London had fully processed what the tablets said. Rassam has been treated, in the history of the discovery, as a supporting character, the native assistant, the local guide. This framing is wrong. Rassam was a scholar in his own right, a man of serious intellectual capacity who went on to excavate sites across the region and contribute substantially to the understanding of ancient Mesopotamia. He was present at one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in history, not because he happened to be there, but because he had spent years developing the knowledge and the relationships and the practical skills that the work required. He was also a man who was digging up the remains of a civilization that was, in a complicated way, his own. The Assyrian Christian community to which he belonged traced its history back to the very region and the very era that the Nineveh tablets represented. He was not a disinterested, outside observer excavating someone else's past. He was a person with a complex relationship to the material he was uncovering, a relationship that neither his Victorian colleagues nor the later historiography of the discovery fully engaged with. What did it mean to Hormuzd Rassam to dig up the palace of Ashurbanipal? We have his published accounts of the excavations, which are professional and careful and focused on the archaeological evidence. We have letters and reports. We have the record of a man doing his job very well. We do not have his interior experience of standing in the excavation trench and holding tablets that were written in the region where he was born, that recorded the civilization of people who were, in some sense, his ancestors in geography, if not in direct lineage, that had been in the ground since before Christianity existed and had been found by him. In this century, in this lifetime, in this work that he had chosen to do. That experience is not in the record. The tablets were shipped to London, to the British Museum, which was becoming one of the most important repositories of ancient Mesopotamian material in the world. And there they sat, waiting for someone who could read them. Cuneiform, the writing system pressed into the tablets, had been a dead script for roughly 2,000 years by the time the Nineveh tablets arrived in London. The process of decipherment had been underway for decades, driven by multilingual inscriptions, brilliant, comparative, linguistic work, and the kind of sustained intellectual effort that makes the decipherment of ancient scripts one of the great achievements of 19th century scholarship. By the 1860s, cuneiform was readable. A scholar named George Smith worked at the British Museum in the 1860s and 70s as an assistant in the department responsible for the Nineveh tablets. He was not from a wealthy or academically distinguished background. He had educated himself in cuneiform and Assyrian language largely through his own determination and his access to the museum's collection. He was exceptionally talented at the specific intellectual work of piecing together fragmentary tablets and reading damaged cuneiform script. In 1872, George Smith was working through the Nineveh tablets, making his way through the collection systematically, translating and cataloguing, noting what was on each piece, and he read something that stopped him. The tablet in his hands was a fragment of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The fragment he was reading contained a description of a great flood, a man warned by the gods that the world would be destroyed by water, the building of a boat, the survival of one family while everything else drowned, the birds sent out to find dry land, the boat grounding on a mountain, the man stepping out and offering sacrifice to the gods who had saved him. George Smith read this and understood what he was looking at. He was looking at a flood story, written in cuneiform, on a clay tablet, found in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's palace in Nineveh, preserved by the fire that destroyed that palace, recovered from the rubble by Hormuzd Rassam, shipped to London, and now in his hands, a flood story that predated the book of Genesis by centuries, a flood story that told essentially the same narrative that the Hebrew Bible would later tell, with different names and different divine machinery, but the same structural shape, the same ark, the same flood, the same birds, the same mountain, the same thanksgiving after the waters receded. By contemporary accounts, George Smith became extremely agitated when he made this realization. He reportedly stood up. He reportedly began to remove his clothing, in the way that people sometimes do when they are in a state of excitement that exceeds the capacity of normal behavior to contain it. He had just read something written 4,000 years ago, something that nobody had read in 2,000 years, something that changed the understanding of where some of the most fundamental stories in Western civilization had come from. He had found it in a fragment, in a collection of fragments, recovered from a mound of rubble, from the ruins of a city destroyed 2,400 years before he was born. The tablet had survived because of fire. The fire that ended Nineveh had preserved the library that Ashurbanipal had built to control knowledge. That library had waited in the ground for the right person to come along and read what was in it. And when the right person came along, he found, among everything else, one of the oldest stories in the world, a story about a flood, a story about a man who survived when everything around him was destroyed. Now think about what Ashurbanipal had intended when he collected that text. He had collected it because it was a text about a great king, and about the relationship between kings and gods, and about the kind of divine favor that allowed certain people to survive catastrophes that destroyed everyone else. He had collected it as part of the argument that the library made about who he was and why his power was legitimate. He had collected it to control the argument, and instead, it outlasted the argument. It outlasted the empire the argument was made for. It outlasted the language it was written in. It outlasted the city it was stored in. It outlasted every institution and every political arrangement and every human structure that existed in the world when it was written down. It outlasted Ashurbanipal by 3,000 years and counting. Not because Ashurbanipal had been wise enough to build something that would last that long, not because he had understood the future in some way that allowed him to design for it, but because clay is a remarkable material and fire does remarkable things to it. And because the rubble of a palace is better storage than most things, human beings have deliberately constructed for the purpose of storage. And because a self-taught scholar in a Victorian museum happened to be systematic enough and talented enough to work through a collection of fragments until he found the ones that fit together into something that stopped his heart. History did not plan this. History never plans anything. It just happens. In the accumulation of decisions and accidents and material facts and coincidences that produce outcomes, nobody sitting at the beginning of the chain could have predicted from the links they could see. Ashurbanipal built a library to control the world. The world burned down the library. The fire made the library permanent. And now the library is in London and in museums around the world, and in scholarly publications, and in the translations that put the words of Mesopotamian scribes into every language spoken on earth. And Ashurbanipal's name is on some of the tablets, and the ones his name is not on are carrying knowledge that belongs to the people who first wrote it down. People whose names are also not on the tablets. People who were part of civilizations that Ashurbanipal destroyed or dominated or simply overshadowed in the way that powerful empires overshadow everything near them. The tablets carry all of this. The ownership claim and the appropriation and the destruction and the preservation and the accident of fire and the patience of 2,400 years of darkness, and the moment a man in London removed his coat in a museum because he had just read a flood story. All of it is there, in the clay, baked hard by the fire that was supposed to end it, still there. London, December of 1872, of the Common Era. The British Museum in winter has a particular quality of light that is different from what it has in summer. The high windows of the gallery rooms let in a grey, diffuse illumination that falls on the objects without the warmth that direct sunlight would bring. It is the kind of light that makes old things look older, that strips away whatever sense of life and colour they might carry on a brighter day and reveals them as what they fundamentally are. Stone, clay, the remains of things. George Smith was not thinking about the light. He was thinking about the fragment in his hands, and about the fragments he had examined the week before, and about the way certain signs on certain tablets were beginning to connect to signs on other tablets in ways that suggested a larger text underneath the fragmentation. A continuous narrative broken into pieces by the collapse of a palace ceiling 2,400 years before he was born. He had been working with the Nineveh collection for years by this point. The tablets had arrived in London in shipments over the course of the 1850s and 1860s, packed in crates, many of them already broken. Some shattered into dozens of pieces that had to be sorted and matched before any reading could begin. The British Museum had assigned people to this work, and George Smith was one of them. Arguably the most talented of them. He had taught himself, that is the thing that is easy to pass over and should not be. He had not gone to Oxford or Cambridge. He had not studied under the great cuneiformists of his era as a young man in a formal program. He had encountered the tablets at the museum, had become interested in the script, had obtained materials to study it on his own, and had worked until he could read it with a proficiency that the formally trained scholars of his era recognized as exceptional. He was not supposed to be the person who found what he found, but he was the person who found it. The fragment he was working with on that December day in 1872 was part of a series of tablets belonging to a continuous narrative involving a figure named Gilgamesh. The Gilgamesh material was already known to exist in the collection. Smith had been working through it systematically, making sense of what was there, noting what was missing, trying to establish the shape of the original text from the surviving pieces. And on that day, on that specific fragment, he read something that made him understand that the shape of the original text was larger and stranger and more significant than he had realized. He was reading about a flood. The signs were clear to him. He had been reading cuneiform long enough that difficult passages were difficult, in the way that difficult passages in a language you know well are difficult, requiring effort and attention, but not the fundamental uncertainty of someone working in unfamiliar territory. He read the signs. He understood what they said. A man is warned by a god that a great flood is coming. The man is instructed to build a vessel. He builds it. The flood comes. Everything is destroyed. The man and his family survive on the vessel. The waters recede. The man sends out birds to determine whether dry land has appeared. The birds return, then eventually do not return. The vessel grounds on a mountain. The man offers sacrifice to the gods. George Smith had read the book of Genesis. Every educated person in Victorian England had read the book of Genesis. He knew the story of Noah. He knew it in the way that people know texts that have been part of their cultural formation since childhood, with the familiarity that breeds a kind of invisible assumption. The assumption that this story is where it is, because this is where such stories come from. And now he was holding a clay tablet from the ruins of Ashurbanipal's palace in Nineveh, a tablet written in a language that had been dead for 2,000 years. And the tablet was telling him a flood story that predated Genesis, a flood story that had the same birds, the same mountain, the same structure of warning and survival and thanksgiving, a flood story that had been sitting in Ashurbanipal's library when Ashurbanipal was alive, that had been in that library when the armies destroyed the city, that had been baked hard by the fire of that destruction, that had lain in the rubble for 2,400 years, that had been dug up by Hormuzd-Rassam and shipped to London and sorted and catalogued and placed in a storage system and eventually put in front of George Smith on a grey December day in 1872. The accounts of what happened next come from people who were present, and they agree on the essential fact, if not on every detail. George Smith stood up. He may have said something. The accounts differ on what, if anything, he said. What they agree on is that he began to remove his clothing. Not all of it, or not all of it, in the versions of the story that Victorian propriety is most comfortable relating, but enough that the people around him in the museum noticed and found the behavior remarkable enough to record. He was not performing. He was not making a statement. He was a man in a state of excitement that exceeded the capacity of normal professional behavior to contain, doing something that his body apparently decided was the appropriate response to what had just happened to his understanding of the world. He had read a 4,000-year-old flood story in a dead language on a clay tablet from a destroyed city. And it was the same story, not the same in every detail. Different names, different divine machinery, different cultural context surrounding the narrative, but the same story in the way that matters, which is structurally the way that stories are the same when they are drawing on the same deep pool of human experience and human need that produces certain narratives in every culture that has ever tried to account for catastrophe and survival. The same story, in a tablet from Ashurbanipal's library. Now, hold that fact alongside everything we have established about how Ashurbanipal's library came to exist. The flood tablet was in Nineveh because Ashurbanipal had collected it. It was part of the project of gathering all knowledge to a central location, of putting the king's name on the accumulated intellectual heritage of the civilization, of making Nineveh the authoritative home of everything worth knowing. The flood story had existed before Ashurbanipal. It was old when he was born. Versions of it had been circulating in the ancient Near East for a long time, appearing in different forms, in different scribal traditions across the region. The version that ended up in Ashurbanipal's library was the version that his scribes had access to, the version that fit the collection's organization, the version that carried the royal label, Palace of Ashurbanipal, King of the World, King of Assyria. He had not written the flood story. He had not preserved it out of any foresight about its future significance. He had collected it because it was a text that belonged in a comprehensive royal library, because it was part of the Gilgamesh epic, which was part of the great tradition of Mesopotamian literature that a king who wanted to demonstrate his cultural authority needed to own. He owned it, and then the fire baked it hard, and the rubble buried it, and 2,400 years passed, and George Smith read it in London. But there is another person in this story who gets less attention than Smith and deserves more. Hormuzd-Rassam. Rassam was born in Mosul, across the Tigris from the mound of Kuyunjik. In 1826 of the Common Era, he was an Assyrian Christian, part of a community that had maintained a continuous presence in the region since antiquity. He became Layard's assistant. And then, when Layard returned to England, Rassam continued the excavations. It was Rassam who excavated the North Palace at Nineveh. It was Rassam who directed the workers, who supervised the removal of the tablets, who understood from the beginning that what was coming out of the ground was of extraordinary importance. Rassam has been treated, in the history of the discovery, as a supporting character, the native assistant, the local guide, the man who was there because someone local was needed. That framing is wrong. Rassam was a scholar in his own right, a man of serious intellectual capacity who contributed substantially to the understanding of ancient Mesopotamia. He was present at one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in history, not because he happened to be there, but because he had spent years developing the knowledge and the relationships and the practical skills that the work required. He was also a man who was digging up the remains of a civilization that was, in a complicated way, his own. The Assyrian Christian community to which he belonged traced its history back to the very region and the very era that the Nineveh tablets represented. He was not a disinterested outside observer excavating someone else's past. He was a person with a complex relationship to the material he was uncovering, a relationship that neither his Victorian colleagues nor the later historiography of the discovery fully engaged with. What did it mean to Hormuzd Rassam to stand in the excavation trench and hold tablets written in the region where he was born, recording the civilization of people who were in some sense his ancestors in geography, if not in direct lineage? Tablets that had been in the ground since before Christianity existed and that had been found by him. In this century, in this lifetime, in this work that he had chosen to do, we have his published accounts of the excavations, which are professional and careful and focused on the archaeological evidence. We do not have his interior experience of that. That experience is not in the record, which means that what we have of the discovery of Ashurbanipal's library is, once again, incomplete in the particular way that history is always incomplete. The full picture includes Rassam's experience and the experience of the Iraqi workers who did the physical labor of excavation, and the experience of the communities living near the site who watched foreigners dig up their landscape and ship its contents to London. Those experiences are mostly not in the record. The tablets are in London. The people who found them, in the fullest sense of found, the people who had been living beside the mound for generations, who had given it its name, who had maintained the landscape within which the tablets waited for someone to come and recognize what they were. Those people are in the gaps of the official story, the same way that the provincial scribes whose texts Ashurbanipal appropriated are in the gaps of his story, the same way that the Elamite scholar who watched the tablets being carried out of Susa is in the gaps. History keeps its gaps in the same places. At the point where the person doing the taking and the person from whom the taking is done meet, and only one of them has the means to tell the story afterward. George Smith took his discovery to the public in a lecture at the Society of Biblical Archaeology in December of 1872. The audience included William Gladstone, who was, at that point, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The lecture was a sensation. Smith read out his translation of the Flood Tablet and described what it meant for the understanding of the relationship between ancient Near Eastern texts and the Hebrew Bible. The Daily Telegraph newspaper funded an expedition to Nineveh to search for additional fragments. Smith went. He found more pieces of the Gilgamesh text. He continued his work on the collection until his death in 1876. At the age of 36, of dysentery contracted during one of his expeditions to the region. He died young, He did not finish the work. Nobody finishes the work, in the sense that the tablets are still being studied, still being translated, still yielding new understanding as scholars bring new methods and new questions to material that has been in collections for 150 years. The work of reading what Ashurbanipal collected is ongoing. It will continue after everyone currently doing it is gone. That is the nature of an archive. It outlasts the people who use it. It outlasts the people who built it. It waits, in the way that objects wait, for whoever comes next. Ashurbanipal waited 2,400 years for George Smith. George Smith waited in his Victorian museum for the fragment that would stop him. The fragment waited in the rubble of Nineveh for Hormuzd Rassam. Rassam waited beside the Tigris for a British diplomat who believed that important things were under the mounds. The mounds waited through the rise and fall of the Babylonian Empire, and the Persian Empire, and the Macedonian Empire, and the Seleucid Empire, and the Parthian Empire, and the Roman Empire, and the Sassanid Empire, and the Arab Caliphates, the Mongol invasions, and the Ottoman Empire, and the arrival of modernity. For anyone to come and understand what they were, this is what surviving looks like. Not triumphant, not planned, not the product of anyone's foresight or design, just the accumulation of coincidences and material facts and the specific properties of clay under fire that added up, over an expanse of time that the human mind struggles to hold, to the moment when a man in a London museum read a 4,000-year-old flood story and took off his coat. The king of the world had wanted to own all knowledge. He ended up being found by it. Go back to the beginning, the room with the low ceiling and the oil lamps and the smell of wet clay, the scribe sitting with his stylus and his fresh piece of clay and the tablet he is copying, the text in front of him that might be a medical formula or a poem about a man who searched for the meaning of death and found that he could not transcend it. He does not know what he is copying. He does not know that the tablet in front of him is part of a collection that a king spent decades building with the belief that knowledge was the purest form of power. He does not know that the building he is sitting in will burn in a fire that will do something to the tablet in front of him that no craftsman in Nineveh could have deliberately achieved. He does not know that what he is pressing into clay will lie in the dark for 2,400 years, and then be carried to a city on an island in the Northern Ocean that has not yet been built, to be read by a man speaking a language that does not yet exist. He picks up his stylus. He presses the first mark into the wet clay. He writes, at the top of the new tablet, the line he has written so many times that his hand produces it from memory without requiring instruction from his mind. Palace of Ashurbanipal, King of the world, King of Assyria. Here, at the end of this story, stay with that line for a moment. That line is the claim. That line is what the whole project was about. The library, the reliefs, the campaigns, the carefully managed royal image. All of it was in the service of that line. The king of the world, the person at the center, the one who owned the knowledge and therefore owned the argument about how the world was organized and who was authorized to organize it. The scribe writes the line. The tablet dries. The city burns. The tablet survives. 2,400 years pass. And when the tablet is finally read again, what does that line mean? It means that this tablet was in Ashurbanipal's library. It means that his name is attached to this knowledge the way a label is attached to a jar, identifying the jar's contents as belonging to a particular shelf in a particular household. It does not mean that he owned the knowledge. It means that he thought he did. This is the distinction that 3,000 years of distance makes visible. The knowledge in those tablets did not belong to Ashurbanipal, any more than the flood story belonged to the Babylonian scribes who wrote it, or to the Sumerian tradition that predated them, or to the human experience of catastrophic flooding that generated the story in the first place. Knowledge does not belong to anyone. It moves. It accrues. It passes from one hand to another, one language to another, one civilization to another. And the idea that any one person or institution or empire owns it is an illusion that feels true from the inside and looks obviously provisional from the outside. Ashurbanipal was inside the illusion. He could not have seen it as an illusion, because the illusion was the shape of the world he lived in. Power meant control, control of land, of people, of military capacity, and, as he understood more deeply than most rulers of his era, control of knowledge. He controlled it. He put his name on it. He called himself the king of the world, and the phrase was not empty. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful political figure of his era, and then he died. And within 2 decades, the empire was gone. And within a few more, the city was ruins. And within a few more, the ruins were a mound that people walked past without knowing what was underneath. And the tablets waited. Now, here is the question that all of this has been building toward. The question we placed at the beginning of this story. In chapter 1, before we knew what it would cost, what does it cost to be the one who stays when someone you love chooses to go? Ashurbanipal had 30,000 tablets. He did not have a way to read his brother, and his brother chose the fire. And Ashurbanipal continued to collect. He continued to add to the library in the years after Babylon fell. He continued to put his name on tablets. He continued to call himself the king of the world, and to govern his empire, and to do everything that a king was required to do. And somewhere in the palace, in the rooms where the tablets were kept, the Gilgamesh epic sat on its shelf, the story of a man who lost the person closest to him and could not find a way back from that loss, who searched the world for an answer to the question of how you survive someone else's death, who found, at the end of his searching, that there was no answer. That death was the price of being human, that the gods had kept immortality for themselves, that the man standing before the walls of his city, looking at the walls he had built, had to find whatever meaning he could find in that, in the making, in the building, in the fact that the walls were there. Ashurbanipal read that story. He collected it. He put his name on it. He built his library. The walls he built were clay and fire. It turned out, was exactly what clay needed to last. That is the answer to the question of what Ashurbanipal built and whether it lasted. But it is not the answer to the question that the tablets cannot answer, the question that no knowledge system, however comprehensive, however carefully organized, however powerfully backed by the authority of the most powerful king in the ancient world, can answer. What does it cost to be the one who stays? Ashurbanipal collected more tablets. He kept adding to the archive. He kept putting his name on things. He called himself the king of the world, and somewhere in the collection, in one of the 30,000 tablets that bore his name, and survived the fire, and lay in the dark for 2,400 years, and ended up in London, the scribe who copied the Gilgamesh epic pressed his stylus into wet clay and wrote the words that the story ends with, the words about Gilgamesh standing before the walls of his city, looking at what he had made, finding in the making the only answer the world was going to give him. The tablets are still there. The question is still there. We are still reading. And the answer, if there is one, is not in the clay. It is in the reading. It is in the fact that 3,000 years after, a king put his name on 30,000 tablets and called himself the owner of all knowledge. We are still here, asking the question that the knowledge cannot answer, still asking it, still reading, still finding. In the asking, the only thing that might be as close to an answer as we are going to get, which is that someone asked it before us, and wrote it down, and the writing survived, somewhere beside the river Tigris. The water catches the morning light the way it has always caught morning light, every morning, before the city was built, and after the city was gone, before the tablets were collected, and after they were buried, and after they were found again and shipped to London and placed behind glass in a museum in a country the river has never heard of. The river does not know what it preserved. It does not know about the scribe in the room, or the king who put his name on everything, or the brother who chose the fire, or the Victorian scholar who took off his coat in a museum because he had just read a 4,000-year-old flood story. The river just keeps moving, the way it always has, the way it always will. And we are still here. Palace of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria. The world is gone. The tablets remain,